You fool! Warren is dead. Welcome to Horror Babble. Today, we've compiled a collection of stories that focus on items of a curious and/or odious nature. A coat and a doll's house, mirrors and a statue. These objects are horrible indeed. All of the included recordings have been remastered. And without further ado, The Coat by A.E.D. Smith. I am quite aware that the other fellows in the office regard me as something of an oddity, as being rather a queer bird, in fact. Well, of course, a man who happens to be of a studious disposition, who dislikes noise and prefers his own company to that of empty-headed companions, and who, moreover, is compelled by defective vision to wear thick glasses, is always liable to be thus misjudged by inferior minds, and ordinarily I treat the opinion of my colleagues with the contempt it deserves. But at this particular moment I was beginning to think that perhaps, after all, there might be something to be said for their view. For, though I might still repudiate the queer bird part of the business, undoubtedly I was a fool, a first-class chump. Otherwise, I should have been spending my holidays in a nice, comfortable way with the rest of the normal world, listening to the Pierrots or winking at the girls on the promenade of some seaside resort at home, instead of having elected to set out alone on this idiotic push-bike tour of a little-known part of France. Drenched, hungry, and lost, a stranger in a strange land, dispiritedly pushing before me a heavily laden bicycle with a gashed tire, such was the present result of my asinine choice. The storm had overtaken me miles from anywhere, on a wild road over a spur of the Vosges, and for nearly 2 hours a human habitation. And then, at long last, rounding a bend, I glimpsed just ahead of me the chimney-pots and gables of a fair-sized house. It was a lonely, desolate-looking place standing amid a clump of trees, a little way back from the road, and somehow, even at a distance, did not convey a very inviting impression. Nevertheless, 200 yards brought me to the entrance gates, and here I suffered a grievous disappointment, for the roofless porter's lodge, the dilapidated, plainly indicated that the place was no longer inhabited. I speedily comforted myself, however, with the reflection that in the circumstances even a deserted house was not to be despised as a refuge. Once under cover of some aged mount, and without further ado I pushed my bicycle up the long-neglected spin occupied by a person of some quality. Mounted on a pedestal on either side of the iron-studded front door stood a rusty carronade, trophies, probably, of some long-forgotten war in which the former occupier had played a part. Most of the windows had been boarded up, and it was evident that the place had stood empty for many years. I tried the front door. To my surprise, it was unfastened, and a thrust of my shoulder sent it creaking grudgingly back on its hinges. My nostrils, as I stepped into the dim, wide hall, were at once assailed by the stale, disagreeable odor of rotting woodwork and mouldy hangings and carpets. For a moment or two I stood peering uncertainly about me, with the slight feeling of eeriness that one usually experiences when entering an old, empty house. Facing me was a broad staircase, with a long, stained-glass window, almost opaque with dirt and cobwebs, at its head. I mounted the stairs, and, throwing open the first door at hand, found myself looking into a spacious, handsomely furnished room that had evidently once been the chief apartment of the house, though long neglect and disuse had now reduced it to a sorry state. The ornate cornice hung here and there in strips, and in one corner the plaster of the ceiling had come down altogether. Green mould covered the 18th-century furniture, curtains and draperies hung in tatters, and one half of the beautiful old Persian carpet, from a point near the door right across to the fireplace, was overspread by an evil-smelling, bright orange fungus. The fireplace gave me an idea. Could I but find fuel, I might light a fire, make myself a hot drink, and get my clothes properly dried. A little searching in the outbuildings discovered a sufficient quantity of old sticks to serve my purpose, and with a bundle of them under my coat I re-entered the house and briskly made my way upstairs again. But on the threshold of the big room, without quite knowing why, I suddenly checked. It was as though my legs, of their own volition, had all at once become reluctant to carry me farther into the apartment, as if something quite outside of me were urging me to turn about and retreat. I laid the sticks down at my feet, and for a moment or two stood there uncertainly in the doorway. I was beginning to sense some subtle suggestion of danger in the atmosphere of the place. Everything was apparently just as I had left it, yet I had an uneasy sort of feeling that during my brief absence something evil had entered that room and left it again. I am neither a nervous nor a superstitious person, yet I found myself, a moment later, rather shamefacedly picking up my sticks and moving back towards the head of the stairs. Actually, it was not so much fear as a vague, precautionary sense of uneasiness that prompted me. It had occurred to me that perhaps I might feel more comfortable if I remained nearer to the front door and made my fire in one of the rooms on the ground floor. It was an idiotic fancy, I know, but, well, if anything, queer did happen and I had to make a sudden bolt for it, I could get out quicker that way. It was on this second descent of the stairs, as I faced the light from the open front door, that I suddenly noticed something that pulled me up with a decided start. Running up the center of the staircase, and quite fresh in the thick dust, was a broad, broken sort of track, exactly as though someone had recently trailed up an empty sack, or something of that nature. From the foot of the staircase, I traced this track across the hall to a spot immediately below an old, moth-eaten coat that hung from one of a row of coat pegs on the opposite wall. And then I saw that similar tracks traversed the hall in various directions, some terminating before the doors on either side, others leading past the foot of the stairs to the rear regions of the house, but all seeming to radiate from the same point below the coat pegs. And the queerest thing about it all was that of footprints other than my own there was not a sign. Uneasiness once more assailed me. The house appeared to be uninhabited, and yet, plainly, someone or something had recently been in the place. Who or what was the restless, questing creature that had made those strange tracks to and from the old coat? Was it some half-witted vagrant, a woman possibly, whose trailing draperies obliterated her own footprints? I had a closer look at the old garment. It was a military greatcoat of ancient pattern, with one or two tarnished silver buttons still attached to it, and had evidently seen much service. Turning it round on its peg with a gingerly finger and thumb, I discovered that just below the left shoulder there was a round hole as big as a penny, surrounded by an area of scorched and stained cloth, as though a heavy pistol had been fired into it at point-blank range. If a pistol bullet had indeed made that hole, then, obviously, the old coat at one period of its existence had clothed a dead man. A sudden repugnance for the thing overcame me, and with a slight shudder I let go of it. It may have been fancy or not, but all at once it seemed to me that there was more than an odor of mold and rotting cloth emanating from the thing, that there was a taint of putrefying flesh and bone. A taint of animal corruption, faint but unmistakable. I could sniff it in the air, and with it something less definable but no less real, a sort of sixth sense feeling that the whole atmosphere of the place was slowly becoming charged with evil emanations from a black and shameful past. With an effort, I pulled myself together. After all, what was there to be scared about? I had no need to fear human marauders, for in my hip pocket I carried a small but serviceable automatic. And as for ghosts, well, if such existed, they didn't usually walk in the daytime. The place certainly felt creepy, and I shouldn't have cared to spend the night there, but it would be ridiculous to allow mere idle fancies to drive me out again into that beastly rain before I'd made myself that badly needed hot drink and mended my bicycle. I therefore opened the door nearest to me and entered a smallish room that apparently had once been used as a study. The fireplace was on the side opposite to the door, and the wide, ancient grate was still choked with the ashes of the last log consumed there. I picked up the poker, a cumbersome old thing with a knob as big as an orange, raked out the ashes, and laid my sticks in approved Boy Scout fashion. But the wood was damp, and after I had used up half my matches, refused to do more than smoulder, while a backdraft from the chimney filled the room with smoke. In desperation, I went down on my hands and knees and tried to rouse the embers into flame by blowing on them, and in the middle of this irksome operation I was startled by a sound of movement in the hall, a single soft flop, as though someone had flung down a garment. I was on my feet in a flash, listening with every nerve taut. No further sound came, and automatic in hand, I tiptoed to the door. There was nothing in the hall, nothing to be heard at all save the steady swish of the rain outside. But from a spot on the floor directly below the old coat, the dust was rising in a little eddying cloud, as though it had just been disturbed. "Pah, a rat!" I told myself, and went back to my task. More vigorous blowing on the embers, more raking and poking, more striking of matches, and in the midst of it again came that curious noise, not very loud, but plain and unmistakable. Once more I went into the hall, and once more, except for another little cloud of dust rising from precisely the same spot as before, there was nothing to be seen. But that sixth sense warning of imminent danger was becoming more insistent. I had the feeling now that I was no longer alone in the old empty hall, that some unclean, invisible presence was lurking there, tainting the very air with its foulness. "It's no use," I said to myself. "I may be a nervous fool, but I can't stand any more of this. I'll collect my traps and clear out while the going's good." With this, I went back into the room, and keeping a nervous eye cocked on the door, began with rather panicky haste to repack my haversack. And just as I was in the act of tightening the last strap, there came from the hall a low, evil chuckle, followed by the sound of stealthy movement. I whipped out my weapon and stood where I was in the middle of the floor, facing the door, with my blood turning to ice. Through the chink between the door hinges I saw a shadow pass. Then the door creaked a little, slowly began to open, and round it there came the coat. It stood there upright in the doorway, as God is above me, swaying a little, as though uncertain of its balance, collar and shoulders extended as though by an invisible wearer, the old musty coat I had seen hanging in the hall. For a space that seemed an eternity, I stood like a man of stone, facing the thing as it seemed to pause on the threshold. A dreadful sort of hypnotism held me rooted to the spot on which I stood, a hypnotism that completely paralyzed my body and caused the pistol to slip from my nerveless fingers, and yet left my brain clear. Mingled with my frozen terror was a feeling of deadly nausea. I knew that I was in the presence of ultimate evil, that the very aura of the hell-engendered thing reared there in the doorway was contamination, that its actual touch would mean not only the instant destruction of my body, but the everlasting damnation of my soul. And now it was coming into the room, with an indescribable bobbing sort of motion, the empty sleeves jerking grotesquely at its sides, the skirts flopping and trailing in the dust, was slowly coming towards me, and step by step, with my bulging eyes riveted in awful fascination on the thing, I was recoiling before it. Step by step, with the rigid, unconscious movement of an automaton, I drew back until I was brought up with my back pressed into the fireplace and could retreat no farther. And still, with deadly malevolent purpose, the thing crept towards me. The empty sleeves were rising and shakily reaching out towards my throat. In another moment, they would touch me, and then I knew with the most dreadful certainty that my reason would snap. A coherent thought somehow came into my burning brain, something that I had read or heard of long ago, the power of the holy sign against the forces of evil. With a last desperate effort of will, I stretched out a palsied finger and made the sign of the cross, and in that instant my other hand, scrabbing frenziedly at the wall behind me, came into contact with something cold and hard and round. It was, I discovered, the knob of the old, heavy poker. The touch of the cold iron seemed to give me instant repossession of my faculties. With lightning swiftness I swung up the heavy poker and struck with all my force at the nightmare horror before me. And lo, on the instant the thing collapsed and became an old coat, nothing more, lying there in a heap at my feet. Yet, on my oath, as I cleared the hellish thing in a flying leap and fled from the room, I saw it out of the tail of my eye, gathering itself together and taking shape, as it were, to scramble after me. Once outside that accursed house, I ran as never man ran before, and I remember nothing more until I found myself, half fainting, before the door of a little inn. "Bring wine, in the name of God!" I cried, staggering inside. Wine was brought, and a little wondering group stood round me while I drank. I tried to explain to them in my bad French. They continued to regard me with puzzled looks. At length, a look of understanding came into the landlord's face. "Mon Dieu!" he gasped. "It is possible that monsieur has been in that place. Quick, Juliet! Monsieur will need another bottle of wine." Later, I got something of the story from the landlord, though he was by no means eager to tell it. The deserted house had once been occupied by a retired officer of the First Napoleon's army, a semi-madman with a strain of Africa in him. Judging from the landlord's story, he must have been one of the worst men ever allowed to walk the earth. "Most certainly, monsieur. He was a bad man, that one," concluded my host. "He killed his wife and tortured every living thing he could lay hands on, even, it is said, his own daughters. In the end, one of them shot him in the back. The old chateau has an evil name. If you offered 1,000,000 francs, you would not get one of our country folks to go anywhere near the place." As I said at the beginning, I know that the other fellows in the office are inclined, as it is, to regard me as being a bit odd, so I haven't told any of them this story. Nevertheless, it's perfectly true. My brand new bicycle and touring traps are probably still lying where I left them in the hall of that devil-ridden chateau. Anybody who cares to collect them may keep them. The Haunted Doll's House by M.R. James. "I suppose you get stuff of that kind through your hands pretty often," said Mr. Dillett, as he pointed with his stick to an object which will be described when the time comes. And when he said it, he lied in his throat, and knew that he lied. Not once in 20 years, perhaps not once in a lifetime, could Mr. Chittenden, skilled as he was in ferreting out the forgotten treasures of half a dozen counties, expect to handle such a specimen. It was collector's palaver, and Mr. Chittenden recognized it as such. "Stuff of that kind, Mr. Dillett. It's a museum piece, that is." "Well, I suppose there are museums that'll take anything. I've seen one, not as good as that, years back," said Mr. Chittenden thoughtfully. "But that's not likely to come into the market, and I'm told they have some fine ones of the period over the water. No, I'm only telling you the truth, Mr. Dillett, when I was to say that if you was to place an unlimited order with me for the very best that could be got, and you know I have facilities for getting to know of such things, and a reputation to maintain, well, all I can say is, I should lead you straight up to that one and say, 'I can't do no better for you than that, sir.'" "Hear, hear," said Mr. Dillett, applauding ironically with the end of his stick on the floor of the shop. "How much are you sticking the innocent American buyer for it, eh?" "Oh, I shan't be over hard on the buyer, American or otherwise. You see, it stands this way, Mr. Dillett. If I knew just a bit more about the pedigree, or just a bit less," Mr. Dillett put in. Oh, you will have your joke, sir. No, but as I was saying, if I knew just a little more than what I do about the piece, though anyone can see for themselves it's a genuine thing, every last corner of it, and there's not been one of my men allowed to so much as touch it since it came into the shop, there'd be another figure in the price I'm asking. And what's that, 5 and 20? Multiply that by 3 and you've got it, sir. 75's my price. And 50's mine, said Mr. Dillett. The point of agreement was, of course, somewhere between the two. It does not matter exactly where. I think 60 guineas. But half an hour later the object was being packed, and within an hour Mr. Dillett had called for it in his car and driven away. Mr. Chittenden, holding the cheque in his hand, saw him off from the door with smiles, and returned, still smiling, into the parlour, where his wife was making the tea. He stopped at the door. "It's gone," he said. "Thank God for that," said Mrs. Chittenden, putting down the teapot. "Mr. Dillett, was it?" "Yes, it was." "Well, I'd sooner it was him than another." "Oh, I don't know. He ain't a bad fellow, my dear." "Maybe not, but in my opinion he'd been on the worse for a bit of a shake-up." "Well, if that's your opinion, it's my opinion he's put himself into the way of getting one. Anyhow, we shan't have no more of it, and that's something to be thankful for." And so Mr. and Mrs. Chittenden sat down to tea. And what of Mr. Dillett and his new acquisition? What it was, the title of this story will have told you. What it was like, I shall have to indicate as well as I can. There was only just enough room for it in the car, and Mr. Dillett had to sit with the driver. He had also to go slow, for though the rooms of the doll's house had all been stuffed carefully with soft cotton wool, jolting was to be avoided, in view of the immense number of small objects which thronged them, and the 10-mile drive was an anxious time for him, in spite of all the precautions he insisted upon. At last his front door was reached, and Collins, the butler, came out. "Look here, Collins, you must help me with this thing. It's a delicate job. We must get it out upright, see? It's full of little things that mustn't be displaced more than we can help. Let's see, where shall we have it?" After a pause for consideration. "Really, I think I shall have to put it in my own room, to begin with, at any rate. On the big table. That's it." It was conveyed, with much talking, to Mr. Dillett's spacious room on the first floor, looking out on the drive. The sheeting was unwound from it, and the front thrown open, and for the next hour or two Mr. Dillett was fully occupied in extracting the padding and setting in order the contents of the rooms. When this thoroughly congenial task was finished, I must say that it would have been difficult to find a more perfect and attractive specimen of a doll's house in Strawberry Hill Gothic than that which now stood on Mr. Dillett's large knee-hole table, lighted up by the evening sun which came slanting through 3 tall slash windows. It was quite 6 feet long, including the chapel or oratory which flanked the front on the left as you faced it, and the stable on the right. The main block of the house was, as I have said, in the Gothic manner. That is to say, the windows had pointed arches and were surmounted by what are called ogival hoods, with crockets and finials such as we see on the canopies of tombs built into church walls. At the angles were absurd turrets covered with arched panels. The chapel had pinnacles and buttresses, and a bell in the turret and coloured glass in the windows. When the front of the house was open, you saw 4 large rooms, bedroom, dining room, drawing room, and kitchen, each with its appropriate furniture in a very complete state. The stable on the right was in 2 stories, with its proper complement of horses, coaches, and grooms, and with its clock and Gothic cupola for the clock bell. Pages, of course, might be written on the outfit of the mansion. How many frying pans, how many gilt chairs, what pictures, carpets, chandeliers, 4-posters, table linen, glass, crockery, and plate it possessed, but all this must be left to the imagination. I will only say that the base or plinth on which the house stood, for it was fitted with one of some depth, which allowed of a flight of steps to the front door and a terrace partly balustraded, contained a shallow drawer or drawers in which were neatly stored sets of embroidered curtains, changes of raiment for the inmates, and, in short, all the materials for an infinite series of variations and refittings of the most absorbing and delightful kind. Quintessence of Horace Walpole, that's what it is. He must have had something to do with the making of it. Such was Mr. Dillett's murmured reflection as he knelt before it in a reverent ecstasy. Simply wonderful, this is my day, and no mistake. £500 coming in this morning for that cabinet which I never cared about, and now this tumbling into my hands for a tenth, at the very most, of what it would fetch in town. Well, well, it almost makes one afraid something'll happen to counter it. Let's have a look at the population, anyhow. Accordingly, he set them before him in a row. Again, here is an opportunity, which some would snatch at, of making an inventory of costume. I am incapable of it. There were a gentleman and lady, in blue satin and brocade, respectively. There were 2 children, a boy and a girl. There was a cook, a nurse, a footman, and there were the stable servants, 2 postilions, a coachman, 2 grooms. Anyone else? Yes, possibly. The curtains of the 4-poster in the bedroom were closely drawn round all 4 sides of it, and he put his finger in between them and felt in the bed. He drew the finger back hastily, for it almost seemed to him as if something had, not stirred perhaps, but yielded in an odd live way as he pressed it. Then he put back the curtains, which ran on rods in the proper manner, and extracted from the bed a white-haired old gentleman in a long linen nightdress and cap, and laid him down by the rest. The tale was complete. Dinner-time was now near, so Mr. Dillett spent but 5 minutes in putting the lady and children into the drawing-room, the gentleman into the dining-room, the servants into the kitchen and stables, and the old man back into his bed. He retired into his dressing-room next door, and we see and hear no more of him until something like 11 o'clock at night. His whim was to sleep surrounded by some of the gems of his collection. The big room in which we have seen him contained his bed, bath, wardrobe, and all the appliances of dressing were in a commodious room adjoining. But his 4-poster, which itself was a valued treasure, stood in the large room where he sometimes wrote and often sat, and even received visitors. Tonight he repaired to it in a highly complacent frame of mind. There was no striking clock within earshot, none on the staircase, none in the stable, none in the distant church tower. Yet it is indubitable that Mr. Dillett was started out of a very pleasant slumber by a bell tolling 1. He was so much startled that he did not merely lie breathless with wide-open eyes, but actually sat up in his bed. He never asked himself, till the morning hours, how it was that, though there was no light at all in the room, the doll's house on the knee-hole table stood out with complete clearness. But it was so. The effect was that of a bright harvest moon shining full on the front of a big white stone mansion. A quarter of a mile away it might be, and yet every detail was photographically sharp. There were trees about it, too, trees rising behind the chapel and the house. He seemed to be conscious of the scent of a cool, still September night. He thought he could hear an occasional stamp and clink from the stables, as of horses stirring. And with another shock, he realized that, above the house, he was looking, not at the wall of his room with its pictures, but into the profound blue of a night sky. There were lights, more than one, in the windows, and he quickly saw that this was no 4-roomed house with a movable front, but one of many rooms and staircases, a real house, but seen as if through the wrong end of a telescope. "You mean to show me something?" he muttered to himself, and he gazed earnestly on the lighted windows. They would in real life have been shuttered or curtained, no doubt, he thought, but as it was, there was nothing to intercept his view of what was being transacted inside the rooms. 2 rooms were lighted, one on the ground floor to the right of the door, one upstairs on the left, the first brightly enough, the other rather dimly. The lower room was the dining-room. A table was laid, but the meal was over, and only wine and glasses were left on the table. The man of the blue satin and the woman of the brocade were alone in the room, and they were talking very earnestly, seated close together at the table, their elbows on it, every now and again stopping to listen, as it seemed. Once he rose, came to the window and opened it and put his head out and his hand to his ear. There was a lighted taper in a silver candlestick on a sideboard. When the man left the window, he seemed to leave the room also, and the lady, taper in hand, remained standing and listening. The expression on her face was that of one striving her utmost to keep down a fear that threatened to master her, and succeeding. It was a hateful face, too, broad, flat, and sly. Now the man came back, and she took some small thing from him and hurried out of the room. He, too, disappeared, but only for a moment or two. The front door slowly opened, and he stepped out and stood on the top of the perron, looking this way and that, then turned towards the upper window that was lighted and shook his fist. It was time to look at that upper window. Through it was seen a 4-post bed, a nurse or other servant in an armchair, evidently sound asleep. In the bed an old man lying, awake and, one would say, anxious, from the way in which he shifted about and moved his fingers, beating tunes on the coverlet. Beyond the bed a door opened. Light was seen on the ceiling, and the lady came in. She set down her candle on a table, came to the fireside, and roused the nurse. In her hand she had an old-fashioned wine bottle, ready uncorked. The nurse took it, poured some of the contents into a little silver saucepan, added some spice and sugar from castors on the table, and set it to warm on the fire. Meanwhile, the old man in the bed beckoned feebly to the lady, who came to him, smiling, took his wrist as if to feel his pulse, and bit her lip as if in consternation. He looked at her anxiously, and then pointed to the window and spoke. She nodded, and did as the man below had done, opened the casement and listened, perhaps rather ostentatiously, then drew in her head and shook it, looking at the old man, who seemed to sigh. By this time the posset on the fire was steaming, and the nurse poured it into a small 2-handled silver bowl, and brought it to the bedside. The old man seemed disinclined for it, and was waving it away, but the lady and the nurse together bent over him, and evidently pressed it upon him. He must have yielded, for they supported him into a sitting position, and put it to his lips. He drank most of it in several draughts, and they laid him down. The lady left the room, smiling good night to him, and took the bowl, the bottle, and the silver saucepan with her. The nurse returned to the chair, and there was an interval of complete quiet. Suddenly the old man started up in his bed, and he must have uttered some cry, for the nurse started out of her chair and made but one step of it to the bedside. He was a sad and terrible sight, flushed in the face, almost to blackness, the eyes glaring whitely, both hands clutching at his heart, foam at his lips. For a moment the nurse left him, ran to the door, flung it wide open, and, one supposes, screamed aloud for help, then darted back to the bed and seemed to try feverishly to soothe him, to lay him down, anything. But as the lady, her husband, and several servants rushed into the room with horrified faces, the old man collapsed under the nurse's hands and lay back, and his features, contorted with agony and rage, relaxed slowly into calm. A few moments later, lights showed out to the left of the house, and a coach with flambeaux drove up to the door. A white-wigged man in black got nimbly out and ran up the steps, carrying a small leather trunk-shaped box. He was met in the doorway by the man and his wife, she with her handkerchief clutched between her hands, he with a tragic face but retaining his self-control. They led the newcomer into the dining room, where he set his box of papers on the table, and turning to them, listened with a face of consternation at what they had to tell. He nodded his head again and again, threw out his hand slightly, declined, it seemed, offers of refreshment and lodging for the night, and within a few minutes came slowly down the steps, entering the coach and driving off the way he had come. As the man in blue watched him from the top of the steps, a smile not pleasant to see stole slowly over his fat white face. Darkness fell over the whole scene as the lights of the coach disappeared. But Mr. Dillett remained sitting up in the bed. He had rightly guessed that there would be a sequel. The house front glimmered out again before long, But now there was a difference. The lights were in other windows, one at the top of the house, the other illuminating the range of coloured windows of the chapel. How he saw through these is not quite obvious, but he did. The interior was as carefully furnished as the rest of the establishment, with its minute red cushions on the desks, its Gothic stall canopies, and its western gallery and pinnacled organ with gold pipes. On the centre of the black and white pavement was a bier. 4 tall candles burned at the corners. On the bier was a coffin covered with a pall of black velvet. As he looked, the folds of the pall stirred. It seemed to rise at one end. It slid downwards. It fell away, exposing the black coffin with its silver handles and nameplate. One of the tall candlesticks swayed and toppled over. Ask no more, but turn, as Mr. Dillett hastily did, and look in at the lighted window at the top of the house, where a boy and girl lay in 2 truckle beds, and a 4-poster for the nurse rose above them. The nurse was not visible for the moment, but the father and mother were there, dressed now in mourning, but with very little sign of mourning in their demeanour. Indeed, they were laughing and talking with a good deal of animation, sometimes to each other, and sometimes throwing a remark to one or other of the children, and again laughing at the answers. Then the father was seen to go on tiptoe out of the room, taking with him as he went a white garment that hung on a peg near the door. He shut the door after him. A minute or 2 later it was slowly opened again, and a muffled head poked round it. A bent form of sinister shape stepped across to the truckle beds, and suddenly stopped, threw up its arms, and revealed, of course, the father, laughing. The children were in agonies of terror, the boy with the bedclothes over his head, the girl throwing herself out of bed into her mother's arms. Attempts at consolation followed. The parents took the children on their laps, patted them, picked up the white gown and showed there was no harm in it, and so forth, and at last, putting the children back into bed, left the room with encouraging waves of the hand. As they left it, the nurse came in, and soon the light died down. Still, Mr. Dillett watched immovable. A new sort of light, not of lamp or candle, a pale, ugly light began to dawn around the door-case at the back of the room. The door was opening again. The seer does not like to dwell upon what he saw entering the room. He says it might be described as a frog, the size of a man, but it had scanty white hair about its head. It was busy about the truckle beds, but not for long. The sound of cries, faint as if coming out of a vast distance, but, even so, infinitely appalling, reached the ear. There were signs of a hideous commotion all over the house. Lights moved along and up, the doors opened and shut, and running figures passed within the windows. The clock in the stable turret tolled 1, and darkness fell again. It was only dispelled once more to show the house front. At the bottom of the steps, dark figures were drawn up in 2 lines, holding flaming torches. More dark figures came down the steps, bearing first one, then another small coffin. And the lines of torch-bearers with the coffins between them moved silently onward to the left. The hours of night passed on, never so slowly, Mr. Dillett thought. Gradually, he sank down from sitting to lying in his bed, but he did not close an eye, and early next morning he sent for the doctor. The doctor found him in a disquieting state of nerves, and recommended sea air. To a quiet place on the east coast he accordingly repaired by easy stages in his car. One of the first people he met on the seafront was Mr. Chittenden, who, it appeared, had likewise been advised to take his wife away for a bit of a change. Mr. Chittenden looked somewhat askance upon him when they met, and not without cause. "Well, I don't wonder at you being a bit upset, Mr. Dillett." "What? Yes, well, I might say horrible upset, to be sure, seeing what me and my poor wife went through ourselves. But I put it to you, Mr. Dillett, one of 2 things. Was I going to scrap a lovely piece like that on the one hand, or was I going to tell customers, I'm selling you a regular picture palace drama in real life of the olden time, billed to perform regular at 1 o'clock a.m. Why, what would you have said yourself? And next thing you know, two justices of the peace in the back parlour, and poor Mr. and Mrs. Chittenden off in a spring cart to the county asylum, and everyone in the street saying, "Ah, I thought it had come to that. Look at the way the man drank. And me next door, or next door but one, to a total abstainer, as you know." Well, there was my position. What, me have it back in the shop? Well, what do you think? No, but I'll tell you what I will do. You shall have your money back, by the £10 I paid for it, and you make what you can. Later in the day, in what is offensively called the smoke room of the hotel, a murmured conversation between the two went on for some time. How much do you really know about that thing, and where it came from? Honest, Mr. Dillett, I don't know the ass. Of course, it came out of the lumber room of a country house that anyone could guess. But I'll go as far as say this, that I believe it's not 100 miles from this place. Which direction and how far, I've no notion. I'm only judging by guesswork. The man as I actually paid the cheque to ain't one of my regular men, and I lost sight of him. But I have the idea that this part of the country was his beat, and that's every word I can tell you. But now, Mr. Dillett, there's one thing that rather physics me. That old chap, I suppose you saw him drive up to the door. I thought so. Now, would he have been the medical man, do you take it? My wife would have it so, but I stuck to it that was the lawyer, because he had papers with him, and one he took out was folded up. I agree, said Mr. Dillett. Thinking it over, I came to the conclusion that was the old man's will ready to be signed. Just what I thought, said Mr. Chittenden. And I took it that will would have cut out the young people, eh? Well, it's been a lesson to me, I know that. I shan't buy no more dolls' houses, nor waste no more money on the pictures. And as to this business of poisoning Grandpa, well, if I know myself, I never had much of a turn for that. Live and let live. That's been my motto throughout life, and I ain't found it a bad one. Filled with these elevated sentiments, Mr. Chittenden retired to his lodgings. Mr. Dillett next day repaired to the local institute, where he hoped to find some clue to the riddle that absorbed him. He gazed in despair at a long file of the Canterbury and York Society's publication of the parish registers of the district. No print resembling the house of his nightmare was among those that hung on the staircase and in the passages. Disconsolate, he found himself at last in a derelict room, staring at a dusty model of a church in a dusty glass case. Model of St. Stephen's Church, Coxham, presented by J. Mereweather, Esquire, of Ilbridge House, 1877. The work of his ancestor, James Mereweather, 1786. There was something in the fashion of it that reminded him dimly of his horror. He retraced his steps to a wall map he had noticed, and made out that Ilbridge House was in Coxham parish. Coxham was, as it happened, one of the parishes of which he had retained the name when he glanced over the file of printed registers, and it was not long before he found in them the record of the burial of Roger Milford, aged 76, on the 11th of September 1757, and of Roger and Elizabeth Mereweather, aged 9 and 7, on the 19th of the same month. It seemed worthwhile to follow up this clue, frail as it was, and in the afternoon he drove out to Coxham. The east end of the north aisle of the church is a Milford chapel, and on its north wall are tablets to the same persons. Roger, the elder it seems, was distinguished by all the qualities which adorn the father, the magistrate, and the man. The memorial was erected by his attached daughter Elizabeth, who did not long survive the loss of a parent, ever solicitous for her welfare, and of 2 amiable children. The last sentence was plainly an addition to the original inscription. A yet later slab told of James Mereweather, husband of Elizabeth, who in the dawn of life practised, not without success, those arts which, had he continued their exercise, might, in the opinion of the most competent judges, have earned for him the name of the British Vitruvius, but who, overwhelmed by the visitation which deprived him of an affectionate partner and a blooming offspring, passed his prime and age in a secluded yet elegant retirement. His grateful nephew and heir indulges a pious sorrow by this too brief recital of his excellences. The children were more simply commemorated. Both died on the night of the 12th of September. Mr. Dillett felt sure that in Ilbridge House he had found the scene of his drama. In some old sketchbook, possibly in some old print, he may yet find convincing evidence that he is right. But the Ilbridge House of today is not that which he sought. It is an Elizabethan erection of the 40s, in red brick with stone coins and dressings. A quarter of a mile from it, in a low part of the park, backed by ancient, stag-horned ivy-strangled trees and thick undergrowth, are marks of a terraced platform overgrown with rough grass. A few stone balusters lie here and there, and a heap or two, covered with nettles and ivy, of wrought stones with badly carved crockets. This, someone told Mr. Dillett, was the site of an older house. As he drove out of the village, the hall clock struck 4, and Mr. Dillett started up and clapped his hands to his ears. It was not the first time he had heard that bell. Awaiting an offer from the other side of the Atlantic, the doll's house still reposes, carefully sheeted in a loft over Mr. Dillett's stables, whither Collins conveyed it, on the day when Mr. Dillett started for the sea coast. Vanity Limited by Ian Gordon. Statement of Steve Taylor, Vanity Limited Tech Support. Mr. Berman was one of the annoying ones, you know. One of those who always found problems with the equipment. He'd already been through 3 units before his complaint was referred to me, and I was fretting about the 4th, a brand new unit at that. Given his reputation as a bit of a time waster, customer services put the complaint through on a standard, with a 3 to 5 day turnaround. A mistake? Possibly. But they couldn't have known the problem was unprecedented. It was a 3rd generation unit, for goodness sake. 1. March 1st. The delivery driver, a stout chap in his late 40s, pulled up outside the secluded cottage of Mr. Mark Berman at approximately 8:55 a.m. It was a chilly morning in the British Midlands. Frost from the previous night coated the uneven flags leading up to the door. The courier struggled up the pathway with what was assuredly an awkward package, a rectangular cardboard box some 6 feet in height, a foot in width, and another half a foot in depth. Luminous yellow tape surrounded the box, the word fragile emblazoned on it in bold black lettering. The cardboard itself was grey, upon which numerous instances of the words Vanity Limited were visible. As the courier successfully reached the door without stumbling and or dropping the hefty package, the unassuming Mr. Berman emerged from the warmth of the cottage. The man was around 30 years old, sporting a healthy paunch and a penchant for unkempt, receding hair. His eyes were a little too close together, complementing a bird-like, angular face and a sheer rock forehead. Thin lips curled upwards in an artificial smile, as the courier, under considerable duress, staggered into the vestibule with the box, and set it down without incident. Berman, a man of few words, signed for the item, smiled again wanly, and sent the courier on his way. Closing the door, he clutched the box and painstakingly shimmied it from the vestibule into what was apparently some sort of dining-room cum study. Armed with a utility knife, he hastily tore it open, marvelling at the package within. It was a box within a box. The tatty outer shell gave way to a more sophisticated cardboard, finished to resemble brushed steel. Italicized lettering across the front of the package read, "True Reflection. It sees the real you," under which, in smaller lettering, were the words, "By Vanity." Impatiently, Berman attacked the box with a utility knife, stripping the glossy cardboard back to reveal yet another layer of packaging, bubble wrap. He tore it off, eager to claim his prize. And it was done. There before him stood Vanity's latest and ardently coveted model of the freestanding digital display system, True Reflection. The device was now in its 3rd generation, boasting true photorealistic rendering and true speech emulation. Berman had owned more than one of each of the previous generations, and hoped the latest model would be free of the frustrating flaws inherent in its forerunners. At a passing glance, one could almost be forgiven for mistaking True Reflection as nothing more than a freestanding mirror, with its vertical orientation, brushed steel frame, and adjustable mount. And that's precisely what it was, though its internal components were capable of transforming it into something much more than your average looking-glass. The balding 30-year-old nibbled at his fingers as he ran his eyes over True Reflection's matte display screen. It was perfectly smooth, and he likened its featureless surface to that of a black hole in deep space. It absorbed all available light, casting no reflection whatsoever. The screen was a marvel of engineering, and a vast improvement on its predecessors. Mark salivated with excitement. Rummaging through the torn cardboard and bubble wrap, Berman located the power cord. Hastily connecting the female to the system, he proceeded to connect the opposing three-pronged plug to the nearest wall socket. True Reflection drank greedily from the source of electricity, and 3 red lights appeared at the base of the unit. The display screen illuminated, coupled with Vanity's patented synth string jingle, a rather joyous F major 7th chord. Then the system greeted its new owner.
"Hello, Mark,"
it said in a sublime female voice.
"I am True Reflection, version 3.0.
Fully operational, the display screen was now a functioning looking-glass. Berman glanced at his reflection fleetingly, before the familiar sense of self-loathing forced him to look away. Reaching into his pocket, he withdrew a smartphone, and following a fingerprint scan, launched the True Reflection app. Selecting a previously saved template labeled Blue-Eyed Mark, he nibbled at his fingers again, as a modified photograph of himself was downloaded from Vanity's servers. Upon completion of the download, Vanity's melodious jingle sounded again. Using the on-screen editing tools, Mark made some additional changes to what was already a heavily edited image, eyes from brown to blue, and a cheekbone sharpener, and hit Cast. On the display screen, the unwelcome bird-like features of Berman were instantly replaced by those of the modified image. And what a sight it was! The voluptuous hair, the chiseled jaw, and the wild sapphire eyes. Now he could look at himself. Now he could daydream. Now he could masturbate. But there was a setback. True Reflection's display screen flickered, and the unit promptly shut down. The perfect face of Blue-Eyed Mark disappeared. Several iterations of profanity escaped Berman's lips. Once again, he was forced to contact Vanity for assistance. The phone call, lengthy and expensive, went much as Mark expected it to. The customer services agent, Diane, offered a service window of 3 to 5 working days.
3 to 5 days?
Berman had raged.
4 fucking machines, 4 fucking complaints, 3 to 5 fucking days?
But his colourful language had no effect on the young agent. Berman, unfortunately, would have to wait 3 to 5 working days for a home visit. 2. March 2nd. The following morning, as Berman strolled into the dining room cum study, clutching a mug of black coffee, he paused. True Reflection had come back online. There was something odd about it. Though the sleek display screen reflected the room faithfully, his image was entirely absent. Withdrawing his smartphone, he launched the True Reflection app. Selecting a template labeled Nordic Mark, he hit Cast. Vanity's heavenly jingle sounded, but the display screen remained blank. Utilizing the app's camera mode, he took a photograph, successfully capturing his morning face, bloated cheeks and all. Making a couple of minor adjustments to the image, eyes from brown to green, and a close shave, he hit Cast again. True Reflection's display screen flickered briefly, but that was all. It remained entirely free of Mark's image. Unsatisfied with the idea he had inherited the properties of a vampire, he took another photograph, in this instance choosing to leave the image unedited. Once more, he hit Cast, and again the display screen flickered before returning to its plain reproduction of the unoccupied room. Berman shook his head in disbelief. Returning to the kitchen, he approached the coffee pot, which was still steaming on the windowsill above the countertop. Glancing outside, he watched the morning mist as it tumbled through the greenery of the mature garden, filtering through the silver birches at the far end. With eyes deceived by both steam and fog, Berman caught sight of a motionless figure amid the pruned rose shrubs. The creeping vapor seemed to animate it, giving flow to its long blonde hair. As the steam from the coffee pot reduced to a wisp, Mark locked eyes with the stranger, and saw that it was a man, a handsome man, who, oddly, bore a striking resemblance to himself. A horrifying thought crossed his mind, followed by a shocking moment of realization. The gentleman in the garden was a template, an edit produced for True Reflection, the image labeled Nordic Mark. Berman's life changed in that instant, concluding that his malfunctioning third-generation True Reflection had somehow projected Nordic Mark into the real world. But how could such a thing be? Retreating from the kitchen, Berman once again launched the True Reflection app and promptly deleted the offending template. But the reproduction remained in the garden. Berman executed the Erase Cast History command. But still, the queer facsimile remained in the garden. In a last-ditched attempt to be rid of the unnecessarily handsome doppelganger, Mark unplugged True Reflection and watched as the reflected image of the dining room cum study disappeared from the display screen. But Nordic Mark remained in the garden, still, silent. Wiping beads of sweat from his brow, Berman contemplated the mysterious guest. He sipped chronically at the mug of coffee, and once again nibbled at the raw and flaking flesh about his fingernails. He reached a decision. He would step outside and face the abomination. With one last sip of coffee, he placed the mug on the countertop, moved from the kitchen to the utility room, and opened the back door. The mist had cleared somewhat, revealing the true ghastly nature of the facsimile. Mark approached it tentatively. "Hello?" he muttered. Nordic Mark remained silent. Berman gulped audibly upon noticing that the figure was in fact breathing, albeit rather slowly. "Hello?" Mark voiced again. But still, the reproduction remained unresponsive. As the balding 30-year-old neared the figure, he noticed unnatural imperfections, smooth white flesh and a lack of fingernails, straw-like hair and blank, mottled eyes. Below its bulbous nose, a cavernous mouth continued to draw air. Berman reached out and touched Nordic Mark's pale hand, eliciting no response. The flesh was supple, but it was cold and sleek. You should come inside," Berman stated, and gripped the creature's hand firmly. Nordic Mark blinked, and as its marbled eyes observed Berman's hand upon its own, it scowled and glared back up at him. Its face was a mask of pure hatred, its dark eyes the hollow suggestion of vicious intent. What's wrong?" Mark asked hesitantly. What had merely been a scowl was now a distortion. It bared its teeth. The facsimile wanted to eat Berman alive. Mark fled back to the house. Leaping into the utility room, he locked the door behind him and immediately turned to look upon his pursuer. And there it was, ambling across the grass like a toddler taking its first steps. But before the once handsome figure had made it even halfway across the garden, it stumbled forwards onto the stone path and shattered into a number of uneven pieces. "Holy fucking shit!" was all Berman could muster up. Taking the decision to leave the accidental creature in the garden, he quickly returned to the dining room cum study. Pulling out his smartphone, He once again launched the True Reflection app. Consulting the FAQ, he wasn't particularly surprised to find no mention of metaphysical manifestations. Still sweating and quite terrified, he put the phone down on the dining table, pulled out one of the chairs, and sat. In what was supposed to be a moment of reflection and contemplation, Berman was startled by a thud in the room above, his bedroom. With the bump came the hideous realization that the subsequent casts following that of Nordic Mark may too have been inadvertently projected into the cottage and/or garden. Mark climbed to his feet and slowly moved in the direction of the stairs, arming himself with a large paperweight along the way. Reaching the bottom of the flight, he heard the disconcerting thud again. A shiver passed through his bones. Berman wasn't cut out for such insanity. His experience was simply that of an introverted loner. Encounters with figments of his imagination were quite simply unheard of. He slowly climbed the stairs, one step at a time, listening. No further thuds were heard. Reaching the landing, he veered to his immediate left and climbed the additional 2 steps to his bedroom. The door was ajar. Pushing it open tentatively, he was relieved to discover an empty room. However, the walk-in wardrobe was closed, and within was enough space for a clone or 2. Nervously, paperweight in hand, he crept up to the wardrobe and pulled open the double doors. Instantly, light fell upon the interior space, and a green-eyed, stubble-free variant of himself spoke aloud. "Hello?" Mark let out a startled shriek and brought the paperweight down upon the head of the disturbingly faithful facsimile. The paperweight crumpled its skull like tinfoil, the force of the impact catapulting a marbled, emerald eye across the room. The clone collapsed to the carpeted surface of the walk-in wardrobe, and a pale blue liquid streamed from what remained of its head. Berman promptly heaved and produced a liquid of his own. He was down to the dry heaves before he found the composure to glance again at the devastated remains of Green-Eyed Mark. But it wasn't over. There was another facsimile in the cottage. There had to be. 3 casts, 3 clones. And so he proceeded across the hall and checked bedrooms 2 and 3. Nothing. He checked the bathroom, including the shower cubicle and the tub. Empty. Downstairs, he checked the living room and the water closet. All clear. The kitchen was an open space, as was the dining room cum study, so that just left the crawl space at the top of the stairs. "Fuck," Mark mumbled under his breath, his fingers tightening around the paperweight. Returning to the top of the stairs, he approached the wooden panels concealing the entrance to the crawl space and crouched before it. The hatch was aligned with the panels, rendering it invisible to the naked eye. Berman feared the prospect of opening it, and so instead knocked. After a moment, something knocked back. "Hello?" Mark mumbled. On the other side of the hatch, a similar voice echoed. "Hello?" "Are you dangerous?" Berman continued. "No," the clone answered. "Are you sure?" Mark reiterated. "I don't want to have to hurt you." "I'm sure," the clone insisted. Berman opened the hatch and saw the very same trousers he himself was wearing. "Come on out," Mark invited. The clone stooped and crawled out of the hatch. Climbing to its feet, it stood at precisely the same height as Berman, and, disturbingly, it was literally his true reflection. He shuddered, recalling the last cast, the subject of which had been an unedited photograph of himself as he had appeared that very morning. That horrible face he loathed, the bird-like features, the disproportioned ears, the pinpoint pupils, the receding hairline, the oily complexion, gazed back at him, faithfully reproduced by the malfunctioning true reflection. And it was all the worse, for he could smell its odor, his odor, and could taste it in the back of his throat. Simultaneously, the two marks were on the dry heaves. Simultaneously, the two marks fainted. 3. March 3rd. When Berman finally regained consciousness, he was forced to consult his watch to determine the date and time. Somehow, he had been out cold for over 16 hours, as it was after 1 a.m. on the morning of March 3rd. His doppelganger, Mark II, was nowhere to be seen. Climbing to his feet, Berman heard the familiar tones of buttons being punched on a smartphone. The faint sounds were coming from downstairs, specifically the dining room cum study, intermittently punctuated by that incessant vanity jingle. "Oh, shit," he managed. Descending the stairs at speed, Mark clumsily burst into the dining room cum study. There, in the dimly lit space by the mantelpiece, Mark II was sat cross-legged in front of True Reflection, Berman's smartphone in his hand. True Reflection was back online, and, as before, it still appeared to be malfunctioning, reflecting the room, but not its inhabitants. "What are you doing?" Mark yelled, addressing the clone. "What I should have done to begin with," the doppelganger answered. "I'm running a diagnostic." "What the hell for? You need to turn that thing off," Mark barked, pointing at the display screen. "It's caused enough bloody trouble as it is." "You think I don't know that?" Number 2 returned. "I've got a bloody clone running amok." Berman gulped, his anxiety increasing. "Fucking hell," he yelled. "You're the fucking clone here. You're lucky I haven't done away with you like I did the others." His comment seemed to distract Mark II momentarily, and in that instant, Berman happened to glance at the phone in the clone's hand. As instructed by the diagnostic tool, the disillusioned facsimile had queued up dozens of templates and was about to hit cast. "Don't you fucking dare!" Berman yelled, lunging towards his doppelganger. But it was too late. Mark II tapped the large green icon, and a batch process was executed. As Mark collided with the clone, the smartphone fell out of its cigar-like fingers and crashed onto the mantelpiece. The display screen shattered on impact, rendering the device inert. "What the hell are you doing?" Mark II demanded, clawing at Berman in an attempt to crawl out from under him. "I was trying to stop you from casting, you stupid bastard!" Berman exclaimed. "You do realize what's going to happen, don't you?" "Of course," the clone casually replied. "As part of the diagnostic process, the app will batch process a number of casts in order to weed out bugs." "Bugs?" Mark practically screamed. "Programming errors and the like," Number 2 replied calmly. "Fuck my life," Berman muttered, shaking his head. Mark II smiled. "Don't worry, it'll take a while to process," it said, in a peculiarly reassuring tone of voice. "In the meantime, I'll put some coffee on and we can talk about what we're going to do with you." "Do with me?" Mark quizzed, aghast. "Do with me? You're the fucking accident here." Number 2 just shook its head. "Come on, calm down. Let's go get some coffee." And with that, Berman's identical clone strolled out of the dining room cum study. Mark frowned and glanced up at True Reflection's display screen. There was something sinister about it now. It towered over him like his master. Its refusal to reproduce his image was a reflection of its contempt towards him. The system was, after all, very familiar with the balding 30-year-old. Berman's true account was synchronized with the third generation of True Reflection and its predecessors, and consequently, it was privy to his casting habits and the archive of disturbing images he had doctored over the years. Perhaps the third generation, with its true central processing unit and true artificial intelligence, disliked the pitiful loner and loathed his wanton desires, particularly that most frequent of casts, the controversial template labeled She-Mark. Berman had spent many an evening in front of She-Mark. The first-generation rendering had been somewhat pixelated, but it had served its purpose. The second generation had improved upon its forerunner greatly, especially in its rendering of the eyes and areolas. But Shemark was Berman's private creation. The machine was incapable of passing judgment, wasn't it? Berman panicked. The clone-turned-barista had executed a diagnostic, an operation designed to eliminate errors by repeatedly casting previously generated templates. Shemark was on its way, as was the recently crumpled green-eyed Mark and the violently unstable Nordic Mark. China Mark and Thai Mark, they were coming too, not to mention Dreamy Mark, Cloudy Mark, and Fairy Mark, and, God help him, Cripple Mark and Ampere Mark. All those weird and wonderful templates he had so fervently gazed upon, they were soon to be his uninvited guests. Leaving the dining-room study, Berman joined Mark II in the kitchen. But to his horror, he wasn't alone. The diagnostics repetition of Mark's last cast, the unaltered image of himself, had spawned another identical clone, Mark III. Swallowing audibly, Mark joined the pair and accepted the mug of coffee the clone to his left offered him. It said, "Turning into a bit of a situation, this, isn't it?" "You can say that again," the clone to Mark's right answered. "Neither of you are supposed to be here," Mark barked, addressing the pair in a vicious tone, nervously sipping at the mug of coffee. Before the clones could respond, the door to the living room swung open, and in strolled a brand new reproduction of Green-Eyed Mark. Eyeballing its new company, it said, "Hello?" "Hello," the clone to the left of Berman returned. Noting its eyes, it added, "Green eyes. At least we can tell you apart from the three of us." Green-Eyed Mark, its pearly skin glossy and marbled eyes glazed, muttered once again, "Hello?" Berman, caught in a web spun of his own vanity, placed the coffee mug on the table and held his head in his hands. What on earth was he going to do? How could this improbable series of events be reversed? It was the dead of night. His smartphone was shattered. Vanity had provided a 3 to 5 day window. Above all else, the situation was utterly absurd. He lifted his head, afraid to look upon his accidental siblings. And then he noticed that the motion sensor light out in the garden had been triggered. The four Marks, green-eyed included, approached the kitchen window and peered out into the misty garden. The flowing vapors were phantom-like in the glow of the security light. As before, the figure was standing among the flowers of the mature garden. As the mist dissipated, the group beheld the unnatural visage of Nordic Mark. The shattered pieces of its previous incarnation lay at its feet. "Hello?" muttered Green-Eyed Mark, quite appropriately this time. Mark II said, "We should probably leave him where he is." "Agreed. He's dangerous," uttered Mark III. The original Mark Berman, however, bracing himself for further clones and malformed monstrosities, added nothing to the exchange. Instead, he returned to the kitchen table, sat, and clutched the still warm mug of coffee. He would sip and sip until the whole sordid business was over. 4. March 5th. Steve Taylor, a member of Vanity's TST, technical support team, arrived at the home of Mr. Mark Berman, a low-priority call-out, at approximately 11 a.m. He had called ahead of his arrival, but Berman's phone was offline, according to the service provider. As Taylor made his way along the damp pathway to the door, he observed a number of silhouettes shuffling back and forth behind the thick blinds adorning the windows of the cottage. Assuming Berman had guests, the tech support operative thought nothing of it and proceeded to knock on the door. The door was promptly answered by a short gentleman of Oriental persuasion, with pinpoint eyes and bird-like features. "Mr. Berman?" Taylor prompted suspiciously. The man motioned for Taylor to enter, but remained silent. Upon entering the cottage, Taylor was struck by an overwhelming scent of fresh coffee and an unusual humidity. Standing in the vestibule, he heard dozens of voices, all of which seemed to be muttering indistinctly in similar, droning voices. The Asian doorman motioned towards the door connecting the vestibule to the cottage proper. Taylor opened the door and stepped into a dark fantasy. The cottage was crowded, filled with men and women of the most unusual sort. Each and every face was but a variation on a theme. Sometimes the look was feminine, but more often than not it was masculine. The creatures gawped with their pinpoint eyes, tempting Taylor into a surreal world of receding hairlines and sheer rock foreheads. And then a figure would approach with wide, protruding eyes and long flowing hair, followed by his or her twin, bulbous noses sniffing the air as if in search of prey. Taylor retreated, plunging himself deeper and deeper into the depths of the cottage. There, in a shadowy corner of a large living room, he observed copulation. Malformed, armless figures plunged wildly into hellish hermaphrodites. The sounds the act elicited were shrill and deafening, the act itself seemingly excruciating for its participants. Rows of motionless, green-eyed clones silently watched as the horror unfolded. Coughing and spluttering as he stumbled out of the room, the tech support operative soon found himself in what appeared to be a dining room cum study. Amongst the strange bodies littering the room, his eyes fell upon the shattered display screen of the True Reflection unit, the remaining fragments of which continued to reflect the room, but only the room, not the writhing forms of the deformed and perverted surrounding it. Gasping for air, he retreated, and in his confusion found himself in the kitchen, which was evidently the primary source of the overwhelming smell of coffee. Across the room, beyond the inconsistent shapes and forms of the bird-like brethren, Taylor observed a steaming coffee pot, and beyond that, in the fertile garden outside, stood a group of tall, blonde mannequins, their stillness akin to members of the Terracotta Army. The horror was overwhelming, but Taylor maintained his composure. As he turned to leave, he caught sight of something. A quiet figure, at odds with the other individuals in the cottage, was sitting quite calmly at the kitchen table, his hands clutching an empty mug. The man's face held a look of dejection, but Taylor also saw a touch of guilt, and in a moment of dawning realization, he recalled the words probability and accountability as whispered amongst members of Vanity's DT development team. Indeed, something truly horrifying had beset Mr. Berman, and the third-generation True Reflection was responsible, or rather, the greedy directors at Vanity Limited, who had rushed out an appliance unfit for public consumption. The implications were astounding. "Mr. Berman?" Taylor finally prompted, moving towards the hunched figure. But it wasn't the man at the table that answered, rather the occupants of the room. Every man, every woman, every ghastly variation proffered a response. "Yes?" they replied enthusiastically. But Taylor's eyes remained fixed upon the man at the table, the template from which the nightmare scenario had unfolded. The tech support operative joined him at the table and whispered once again, "Mr. Berman?" "I saw it in the garden first," Mark mumbled. "It fell and came apart. Then there was another in the wardrobe. I killed it." Taylor frowned, but continued to listen. "Then I found one in the crawl space, just like me." "What happened to that one?" the tech support operative asked nervously. Mark Berman looked up, shrugged, and simply muttered, "I'm just going to sip till it's over." Taking no chances, Steve Taylor fled the cottage at Brookend and proceeded to log what was deemed an unprecedented case with the development team at Vanity Limited. Some weeks later, Berman's neighbor, Mrs. Finch, made several complaints to the local authority regarding a lack of activity at the cottage. The subsequent police investigation led to the discovery of an empty property, with evidence to suggest that a large party or gathering of some sort had taken place in the days or weeks prior. Amongst the clutter, no physical evidence was recovered to suggest foul play, though one officer proposed that an elaborate staging had taken place, citing the presence of industrial cleaning products not typically found in your average household, though the purpose of such a staging could not be determined. The only traceable witness was Mr. Steve Taylor, of Vanity Limited, who was responding to a service request on behalf of the reclusive 30-year-old regarding a faulty piece of equipment. The police swiftly approached the tech support operative, hopeful his statement would provide information pertaining to the whereabouts of Mr. Berman. In the interrogation room, Taylor was extremely nervous, and it is owing to a curious remark made at the end of the questioning that investigators are to conduct a second, more thorough search of Berman's cottage. Statement of Steve Taylor, Vanity Limited Tech Support, continued. It is my belief the events that transpired at Brook End were the direct result of faulty components developed by Sancor Incorporated, unprecedented faults to which Vanity Limited cannot be held accountable. You see, True Reflection is just a receiver. It is designed to receive and reflect, nothing more. You wouldn't prosecute a camera for capturing indecent images, would you? The unit probably drove him mad. He was a loner, you see. He obsessed over his appearance, hence the kit. The people he parted with were most likely vagrants, you know, transients who moved on when they finished trashing the place. But as for Mr. Berman himself, who knows what happened to him? Has anybody checked the crawl space? Hello? The Magic Mirror by Algernon Blackwood. It was the last night on board the Mauretania, as she was due in New York next morning. Most of the passengers were busy packing up in their cabins, so that when I strolled into the smoking room, I found it nearly empty, with only a straggler or two lined up at the bar. Fatty, however, was sitting in his usual corner with his two inseparables, Jimmy and Baldy, whose real names I never discovered. When I came in, Baldy was talking about systems at roulette. There are no systems worth a curse, he was saying. It's all baloney to say there are, and most of the wheels are crooked anyhow. I guess you're right, Fatty agreed, though I did once come across a system that was infallible. The trouble was, I couldn't work it long enough to make a real killing. And how was that? Jimmy inquired. Just that the inventor faded away before we could clean up, explained Fatty. Hard luck, you call it. Hard luck isn't the right word. It was a catastrophe. That's what it was, Baldy, a catastrophe. Well, let's have the whole lie, Fatty, said Jimmy and Baldy together, and we'll tell you what we think. It's gospel truth, came the rejoinder, and no lie at all, though I can't blame you if you don't believe it. It was about the strangest thing I ever ran up against, which is saying a lot. To this day I don't know what to make of it. It worked, I will say that for it, but it's got me beat just the same. It is some years ago now, Fatty resumed, delighted to have even what he considered a dud audience of two, that I stayed on rather late at Monty. The season was over, and the sporting club, together with a whole lot of the better hotels, closed down. I had my quarters in a small pub on the Rue de Moulin, I remember, as my own joint was closed too. The grub wasn't too good, and I used to drop in now and again at Quinto's to get myself a good lunch. One day, after lunch, I turned into the public gardens to smoke a cigar and look at the flowers before creeping home for a nap. And I remember that the cigar, given to me up at the golf course by a millionaire friend of mine, was particularly good. I was enjoying it, smoking away, and feeling at peace with all the world, when I noticed a curious-looking figure moving along the path towards me. He was an oldish fellow with a straggly white beard, and he was wearing a funny sort of hat on his head. I had never seen a hat quite like it before, but I found out afterwards that it was called a tarai, or some sort of name like that, and that it was worn a lot in India. There were plenty of empty seats all round me, and I prayed to God the old fellow wouldn't come and sit down within talking distance of me and my cigar. Yet that was exactly what he did. The old bozo comes tottering along till he gets to my bench, and then he parks himself bang down quite close to me. Yes, he parked himself just next door, so that I expected the next minute he would turn and ask me for a match. But he had his match all right, his stinking cheroot too, and he lights up and puffs away without a spot of trouble. Now, as you boys know, if there is one thing I cannot stand, it's the smoke from one of those greenhouse bug killers. So as soon as he got going, I was for going too. I sort of shifted my legs before getting up, and it was just then he turns and looks at me. Did I say looks at me? I can only tell you, Duds, that there was something in his eyes that made me think of lightning. He spoke at the same time, and his first remark somehow took my breath away. I mean that I hadn't expected it. Could you tell something about the gambling here? He asks. Sure, I says, getting my breath back a bit. Sure I can. What's troubling you, stranger? His eyes flashed that queer way again, but all he gives me back was innocent enough. I understand they play a game called roulette, he says, but I don't know anything about it. I'd like to. The less you know, the cheaper for you, I tells him, for he didn't look to me like a man to play the tables, what with his Oxford voice and his strange face that was half a monk and half, I guess, a scholar. Keep your money, I adds, if you've got any. But I want to make some money, he explains, straight off the reel, and quite honest sounding. I've got a plan that's certain. And this time I looks him straight in the eye, lightning or no lightning, though I admit there was something in his eye that made me sort of wonder. Now listen, pal, I tells him, with a fatherly touch that I knew didn't quite come off. Listen to me, will you? Every train that pulls into this burg has some sucker on it that thinks he's going to make good dough, but only 1 in 10,000 ever gets away with it. You take my advice and beat it back to Timbuktu, or wherever you hail from, and just forget it. And I takes a good puff at my cigar for having given good advice for once, feeling easy in my conscience, if you know what I mean. I come from Tibet, not Timbuktu, he corrects me, flashing those googly eyes my way, and I've got with me a magic mirror. I can't lose. It's a magic mirror from Tibet, you see. And his stinking cheroot puffed across into my face and made me cough. Well, of course I knew then that the old boy was nuts. That Tibetan magic business proved it, and yet there was something about him that had me guessing. I had the feeling that he knew a thing or two I didn't know. I can't express it quite. I knew I was on the wrong tack anyway. He had something I'd never met before. I was underrating him. He was childlike, crazy, if you like, but he was something else as well. I only know I let my cigar, that millionaire cigar, go out. That shows you, maybe. What's the great idea? I says, more easily than I felt. Are you going to flashlight from the mirror into the croupier's eye and then grab some dough? If so, I can tell you right now that those methods won't work here. Maybe they're all right back in the sticks in your Tibet, but they won't cut any ice here in Monty. He gave me a sort of patient, half-contemptuous look as though I was a kid. The mirror, he says quietly, shows me what to play. Numbers and colours, or whatever the foolishness is. And he pulls down that awful hat over his lightning blinkers, puffs out a poisonous cloud, and looks out over the flowers in the garden. In other words, he showed me plain enough that he thought I wasn't yet born. Well, this had me fair flummoxed. I just didn't know what to say next. I lit up my cigar again, then threw it away as it no longer tasted good. After a bit, I got going again. I asked him how he got his mirror, thinking it a fair question, and he gives me a long spiel about how he had been interpreter with the British expedition into Tibet, and how some lama gave him the mirror. Good stuff, too, right enough. He did the lama some service or other. They call them devil mirrors, he told me. For why? I asks, wondering what he'll throw me next. Because they bring death and riches, is the answer. Myself, I tells him I don't fancy mirrors like that. You've never seen one, he says, knowing all the answers. True, I tells him. Maybe I don't want to. He said nothing for a bit then. I had the feeling he thought I was a nitwit from Kalamazoo, and that's just what I felt, without knowing why, as though he was giving me the works and I was just dumb. Then he gets going again. I'm an old man now, he says. I'm over 100, if you care to know, and I wish to try this mirror before I die. I promised the llama I would. I must. Only I need a helper. I cannot do it all alone. Well, this flummoxed me right down to the bone. Either he was nuts or I was. Over 100 indeed. Why, those eyes belong to a young man. I thought it over a bit. Where was I asked myself. In Monty or in some weird Tibetan monastery? Of course, I says at length, if that's the way you look at it, I've got nothing to say. Have you got the mirror with you? I'd sure like to have a look at it. Certainly, he agrees, and pulls out of his pocket a little chamois leather bag, and produces from it a small bronze mirror. I handled it cautiously, giving it the once-over. It had some curious figures twined round the polished surface, naked men and women, and their faces were awful. I'm pretty hard-boiled myself, but believe me, those faces made me shudder, so I could hardly bear to look at them. The old boy's mug, too, had something in common with them, it strikes me. Now, he says, watching me hard, do you notice anything peculiar about it? I looked carefully and turned the mirror round in various directions so as to get the reflection of the gardens and the trees. No, I tells him at last. I can't say that I do. Have you seen your own face in it? He asked at length, with a smile I didn't care much about. His question gave me quite a shock. No, I tell him, I have not. Just as well, he says, for if you did, you would die. With that I hands him back his mirror as quick as I could, but he only laughs quietly to himself and slips it back into its bag. And then I began thinking things over to myself a bit. After all, I thought, you don't get handed devil's mirrors in Tibet for nothing. I guess the old boy had to do his stuff before the Lama gave it to him. Something pretty tough, too, or one of the local guerrillas could have handled it. And so I came to the conclusion it was better not to ask any more questions. The only thing that really mattered was whether the mirror would work or not. Go in and try it, I says to him straight. Why not? But he has the answer to that, too. I must have someone with me, he explains again. When I see the numbers in the glass, I can't attend to putting the money on as well. I need a helper, someone I can trust, and I trust you. I had got this far when a wave of suspicion came over me. The old boy was a con man, and he was trying to play me for a sucker. I expected every moment his confederate would come rolling up with some plausible yarn, and that they would start stringing me along to put up some dough. I kept my eyes wide open, but I saw no one. And to fill in time, I asked him about Tibet. He told me plenty about the country, and certainly seemed to know his stuff all right. But as I couldn't check up on it, this didn't get us very far. It sounded genuine all the same. He said he had been born at a mission station right on the frontier, and that his nurse had been a Tibetan woman. When his parents died, he had got a job with the Indian government, and had now retired with a pension, and was on his way to England. He told me a lot, too, about having promised the Lama something about the mirror, but I just couldn't make head or tail of that. He wanted, anyway, to use it for getting money, and here in Monty he saw a chance, so I let it go at that. Sure you've never seen a roulette wheel? I asks him. Never, says he. Well, I'll take you right along and show you one, I says, and I bring the old bird down the street till we get to a shop that has them in the window. Half the shops in Monty stock them, as you know, so that we hadn't far to go. I watches the old fox careful to see if he's going to do an act, but he seems genuinely interested, and he soon got wise to the numbers and dozens and all that, and how it worked. Then I asks him how the mirror's going to show him what to back. I shall see the numbers or the colour in the glass, says he. Well, if you've got any dough, I suggests, Let's go to the rooms and give the thing a whirl. I have 1,000 francs, he says, if you think that will be enough. Plenty, I tell him, if the mirror's any good. But let's start gently with 100-franc stake, just to see how she goes. If we win, we go on. If we lose, we don't. How's that strike you? We shall win, he says, calm as you like, and half the winnings will be yours. You're entitled to them for your kindness to a stranger. Well, this little spiel goes down very well with me, so I just says thank you and takes his hand on it. Talk of a grip! That old 100%er had a fist like iron. Anyway, we wanders over to the casino, and I gets him a ticket for the Salle Privé, and in we goes. And let me tell you, the old bozo was on the up and up all right, for when we gets to the rooms he hands over his mill and asks me to do the staking while he consults his little mirror. Now, as chance would have it, the rooms weren't crowded, and we got a couple of good seats right at the end of one of the tables. I changed the note into plaque, and we were all set. The old guy trots out his mirror and starts staring into it. I watches him close. After a minute or two, his face kind of changes. His skin went whiter, and his features became sort of fixed and hard. I thought at first he'd dropped off to sleep, maybe with his eyes wide open. Only I caught a flash of what I call the lightning in them, and knew he was just too concentrated to blink. You might have thought he was a flapper going to put the lipstick on with that mirror in front of him. It was sure a queer sight. I noticed the croupier nearest to us seems kind of inquisitive and keeps looking at him, but he doesn't say anything. They were paying out just when we sat down, but now they spin the wheel and it is time to stake. I glance at the old crank, and he mutters 15, hardly moving his lips. It was 15 the time before, but all the same my plaque goes on, and sure enough, up she comes. 15! Now that, of course, might be just luck, but it gave me confidence all right. So when next time the old bird mumbles 21, I shoves on 2 plaque to see if I can't give the bank a jolt. And would you believe it, boys, up she comes as pretty as a picture, while I rakes in the dough, trying not to grin like a Cheshire cat as I does it. And so it goes on, just as smooth and easy as I'm telling you, and we sure gave the bank a ride that afternoon. But I thinks it wise to stop at last, as the old fellow is beginning to look kind of petered out, it strikes me. So I take him away to the bar and give him a good slug of brandy, and we split the dough as he said, and then I take him back in a fiacre to his joint. "How much did you win?" asks Baldy. 60 mil between us up to date, and giving him back his mill as agreed. Next morning, Fatty continued, I went round bright and early to see how he was making out, and I found him in rather poor shape. So I tried to persuade him to give the rooms a miss that day. Nothing doing. "Lead me to the tables," he says, firm as a rock. It was your brandy that upset me a little, for, you see, I never touch alcohol. And by his voice you might have thought he was some professor at Oxford starting up his lecture. Anyway, I suggests, let's have a good feed first. And I makes in the direction of Quinto's, for there was a bit of time to fill before the rooms opened. But will he eat? Not a damned swallow, I tell you. Not a single bite. "I shall see better," he whispers to me, "if I have no food. But please do not let me stop you. I will wait till you have had a meal." So that's what happened. A crank, I says to myself, must turn his own handle the way he wants, and I left him to it while I enjoyed the best blowout ever, with plenty of good liquor to wash it down, and the old boy doesn't hurry me one little bit, sitting there quiet and silent as an Indian idol. And when I'd lit my cigar, we roll away in a fiacre back to the casino. We go to the same table again, and I notice the croupier recognizes the old guy and exchanges a quick look with another croupier, and the pair of them watch that mirror pretty close, though there's nothing they can say or do about it, for any guy can look in his pocket mirror if he wants to and see if his hair's straight. And believe me, that mirror does its stuff again, fit to beat the band. Or, I should say, beat the bank, for it just couldn't miss. Every time my pal mutters his number, up it comes, though sometimes I don't quite catch what he mumbles, and so hold back and don't put a plaque on. And when that happens, he gives me one of those sort of lightning looks that puts the blame on me all right. After that, I watches his lips. I make no further mistakes, but start playing the dough real heavy, till we'd won so much I swear I couldn't count it, and I could see that the croupiers don't like it one little bit, they don't. And so it goes on and on, boys, with me watching those mumbling lips like a cat watches a mouse, and making no more mishits, till sudden I notice that those lips of his seem kind of white. No blood in them, I mean. I give his face the once-over, and that don't look right to me either. Made me think of a bladder with the air running out of it. Something was wrong, it seems to me, and I decided we'd had enough for one day, and I'd better get him out. "Come on," I whispers to him. "Let's go. Give it a rest till tomorrow, pal." "One more turn," he whispers back, but the flash from those gig lamps not quite so bright. "I'm seeing better than ever before." So I agrees to that. One turn more can't do us any harm, and he sure was seeing perfect. 13, he mutters, and on go my plaque. Now it so happens that he can reach the number easier than me, so I hand him the dough while I shove a maximum myself on Ampere, just to give the bank a final trimming before we blow. The wheel is spinning lovely when I hear a kind of gasp and a sigh from the old boy, but when I turns quick to look at him, he seems okay. A moment later, the ball settles nice and comfortable in 13, and they pay me on Ampere right enough. Then a strange thing happens. The croupier is in the act of shoving the money over to pay the old guy on his number when he stops, and pulls it back again as though the bank had won. I catches my breath and stares a moment, and everybody stares with me. The room had filled to the brim, and everybody had been watching our play. There came sudden and awful silence. I got my breath back. "What's the matter?" I cries out. "Pay the old man his winnings." And the croupier turned to me without a smile. "Only pay a Palimore," he said quietly, raking the money in. The old boy was dead as a doornail. He had croaked while the wheel was spinning. Can you beat it for bad luck? I looks round quick to see that no one had pinched the mirror, but I'm damned if it isn't broken into 1,000 pieces. Isn't life just plain hell?
The Black Stone Statue by Mary Elizabeth Councilman. Directors, Museum of Fine Arts, Boston, Massachusetts. Gentlemen, today I have just received aboard the SS Madrigal your most kind cable praising my work and asking, humbly as one might ask it of a true genius, if I would do a statue of myself to be placed among the great in your illustrious museum. Ah, gentlemen, that cablegram was to me the last turn of the screw. I despise myself for what I have done in the name of art. Greed for money and acclaim, weariness with poverty and the contempt of my inferiors, hatred for a world that refused to see any merit in my work. These things have driven me to commit a series of strange and terrible crimes. In these days, I have thought often of suicide as a way out, a coward's way, leaving me the fame I do not deserve. But since receiving your cablegram, lauding me for what I am not and never could be, I am determined to write this letter for the world to read. It will explain everything, and having written it, I shall then atone for my sin in, to you, perhaps, a horribly ironic manner, but, to me, one that is most fitting. Let me go back to that miserable, sleet-lashed afternoon as I came into the hall of Mrs. Bates's rooming house, a crawling, filthy hovel for the poverty-stricken like myself, who were too proud to go on relief. When I stumbled in, drenched and dizzy with hunger, our landlady's ample figure was blocking the hallway. She was arguing with a tall, shabbily dressed young man, whose face I was certain I had seen somewhere before. "Just a week," his deep, pleasant voice was beseeching the old harridan. I'll pay you double at the end of that time, just as soon as I can put over a deal I have in mind." I paused, staring at him covertly while I shook the sleet from my hat brim. Fine grey eyes met mine across the landlady's head, haggard now and overbright with suppressed excitement. There was strength, character in that face under its stubble of mahogany brown beard. There was, too, a firm set to the man's shoulders and beautifully formed head. Here, I told myself, was someone who had lived all his life with dangerous adventure, someone whose clean-cut features, even under that growth of beard, seemed vaguely familiar to my sculptor's eye for detail. "Not one day, no siree," Mrs. Bates had folded her arms stubbornly. "A week's rent in advance or you don't step foot into one of my rooms." On impulse, I moved forward, digging into my pocket. I smiled at the young man and thrust almost my last $2 into the landlady's hand. Smirking, she bobbed off and left me alone with the stranger. "You shouldn't have done that," he sighed and gripped my hand hard. "Thanks, old man. I'll repay you next week, though." "Next week," he whispered, and his eyes took on a glow of anticipation. "I'll write you a check for $1,000, $2,000. He laughed delightedly at my quizzical expression and plunged out into the storm again, whistling. In that moment, his identity struck me like a blow. Paul Kennicott, the young aviator whose picture had been on the front page of every newspaper in the country a few months ago. His plane had crashed somewhere in the Brazilian wilds, and the nation mourned him and his co-pilot for dead. Why was he sneaking back into New York like a criminal, penniless, almost hysterical with excitement, with an air of secrecy about him, to hide himself here in the slum district? I climbed the rickety stairs to my shabby room and was plying the chisel half-heartedly on my dancing group, when suddenly I became aware of a peculiar buzzing sound, like an angry bee shut up in a jar. I slapped my ears several times, annoyed, believing the noise to be in my own head, but it kept on, growing louder by the moment. It seemed to come from the hall, and, simultaneously, I heard the stair-steps creak just outside my room. Striding to the door, I jerked it open, to see Paul Kennicott tiptoeing up the stairs in stealthy haste. He started violently at the sight of me and attempted to hide under his coat an odd black box he was carrying, but it was too large, almost 2 feet square, roughly fashioned of wood and the canvas off an airplane wing. But this was not immediately apparent, for the whole thing seemed to be covered with a coat of shiny black enamel. When it bumped against the balustrade, however, it gave a solid, metallic sound, unlike cloth-covered wood. That humming noise, I was sharply aware, came from inside the box. I stepped out into the hall and stood blocking the passage rather grimly. "Look here," I snapped. "I know who you are, Kennicott, but I don't know why you're hiding out like this. What's it all about? You tell me, or I'll turn you over to the police." Panic leaped into his eyes. They pleaded with me silently for an instant, and then we heard the plodding footsteps of Mrs. Bates come upstairs. "Who's got that radio?" her querulous voice preceded her. "I hear it humming. Get it right out of here if you don't want to pay me extra for the electricity it's burning." "Oh, ye gods!" Kennicott groaned frantically. "Stall her. Don't let that gabby old fool find out about this. It'll ruin everything. Help me, and I'll tell you the whole story." He darted past me without waiting for my answer, and slammed the door after him. The droning noise subsided, and then was swiftly muffled, so that it was no longer audible. Mrs. Bates puffed up the stairs and eyed me accusingly. "So it's you that's got that radio. I told you the day you come." "All right," I said, pretending annoyance. "I've turned it off, and anyhow, it goes out tomorrow. I was just keeping it for a friend." "Eh? Well," she eyed me sourly, then sniffed and went on back downstairs, muttering under her breath. I strode to Kennicott's door and rapped softly. A key grated in the lock, and I was admitted by my wild-eyed neighbour. On the bed, muffled by pillows, lay the black box, humming softly on a shrill note. It went, exactly like a radio tuned to a station that is temporarily off the air. Curiosity was gnawing at my vitals. Impatiently, I watched Kennicott striding up and down the little attic room, striking one fist against the other palm. "Well?" I demanded, and with obvious reluctance, in a voice jerky with excitement, he began to unfold the secret of the thing inside that onyx-like box. I sat on the bed beside it, my eyes riveted on Kennicott's face, spellbound by what he was saying. "Our plane," he began, "was demolished. We made a forced landing in the center of a dense jungle. If you know Brazil at all, you'll know what it was like. Trees, 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 crawling insects as big as your fist, a hot, sickening smell of rotting vegetation, and now and then the screech of some animal or bird, eerie enough to make your hair stand on end. We cracked up right in the middle of nowhere. I crawled out of the wreckage with only a sprained wrist and a few minor cuts, but McCree, my co-pilot, you know, got a broken leg and a couple of bashed ribs. He was in a bad way, poor devil. Fat little guy, bald, scared of women, and always cracking wise about something. A swell sport." The aviator's face convulsed briefly, and he stared at the box on the bed beside me with a peculiar expression of loathing. "McCree's dead, then?" I prompted. Kennicott nodded his head dully and shrugged. "God only knows. I guess you'd call it death, but let me get on with it." We slashed and sweated our way through an almost impenetrable wall of undergrowth for 2 days, carrying what food and cigarettes we had in that makeshift box there. A thumb jerk indicated the square black thing beside me, droning softly without a break on the same high note. McCree was running a fever, though, so we made camp, and I struck out to find water. When I came back, Kennicott choked. I stared at him, waiting until his hoarse voice went on doggedly. When I came back, McCree was gone. I called and called, no answer. Then, thinking he might have wandered away delirious, I picked out his trail and followed it into the jungle. It wasn't hard to do, because he had to break a path through that wall of undergrowth, and now and then I'd find blood on a bramble, or maybe a scrap of torn cloth from his khaki shirt. Not more than 100 yards south of our camp, I suddenly became aware of a queer humming sound in my ears. Positive that this had drawn McCree, I followed it. It got louder and louder, like the drone of a powerful dynamo. It seemed to fill the air and set all the trees quivering. My teeth were on edge with the monotony of it, but I kept on, and unexpectedly found myself walking into a patch of jungle that was all black. Not burnt in a forest fire, as I first thought, but dead black in every detail. Not a spot of colour anywhere. And in that jungle, with all its vivid foliage, the effect really slapped you in the face. It was as though somebody had turned out the lights. And yet, you could still distinguish the formation of every object around you. It was uncanny. There was black sand on the ground as far as I could see, not soft jungle soil, damp and fertile. This stuff was as hard and dry as emery, and it glittered like soft coal. All the trees were black and shiny like anthracite, and not a leaf stirred anywhere. Not an insect crawled. I almost fainted as I realized why. It was a petrified forest. Those trees, leaves and all, had turned into a shiny black kind of stone that looked like coal, but was much harder. It wouldn't chip when I struck it with a fallen limb of the same stuff. It wouldn't bend. I simply had to squeeze through holes in underbrush more rigid than cast iron. And all black, mind you, no. Once I stumbled over an object and stopped to pick it up. It was McCree's canteen, the only thing in sight, besides myself, that was not made of that queer black stone. He had come this way then. Relieved, I started shouting his name again, but the sound of my voice frightened me. The silence of that place fairly pressed against my eardrums, broken only by that steady droning sound. But, you see, I'd become so used to it, like the constant ticking of a clock, that I hardly heard it. Panic swept over me all at once, an unreasonable fear, as the sound of my own voice banged against the trees and came back in 1,000 echoes, borne on that humming sound that never changed its tone. I don't know why. Maybe it was the grinding monotony of it and the unrelieved black of that stone forest. But my nerve snapped, and I bolted back along the way I had come, sobbing like a kid. I must have run in a circle, though, tripping and cutting myself on that rock underbrush. In my terror, I forgot the direction of our camp. I was lost. Abruptly, I realized it. Lost in that hell of coal-black stone. Without food, or any chance of getting it, with McCree's empty canteen in my hand, and no idea where he had wandered in his fever. For hours I plunged on, forgetting to backtrack, and cursing aloud because McCree wouldn't answer me. That humming noise had got on my nerves now, droning on that one shrill note until I thought I would go mad. Exhausted, I sank down on that emery sand, crouched against the trunk of a black stone tree. McCree had deserted me, I thought crazily. Someone had rescued him, and he had left me here to die, which should give you an idea of my state of mind. I huddled there, letting my eyes rove in a sort of helpless stupor. On the sand beside me was a tiny rock that resembled a butterfly delicately carved out of onyx. I picked it up, dazedly, staring at its hard little legs and feelers like wire that would neither bend nor break off, and then my gaze started wandering again. It fastened on something a few dozen paces to my right, and I was sure then that I had gone mad. At first, it seemed to be a stump of that same dark mineral, but it wasn't a stump. I crawled over to it and sat there, gaping at it with my senses reeling, while that humming noise rang louder and louder in my ears. It was a black stone statue of McCree, perfect in every detail. He was depicted stooping over, with one hand holding out his automatic, gripped by the barrel. His stocky figure, aviator's helmet, his makeshift crutch, and even the splints on his broken leg were shiny black stone, and his face, to the last hair of his eyelashes, was a perfect mask of black rock, set in an expression of puzzled curiosity. I got to my feet and walked around the figure, then gave it a push. It toppled over, just like a statue, and the sound of its fall was deafening in that silent forest. Hefting it, I was amazed to find that it weighed less than 20 pounds. I hacked at it with a file we had brought from the plane in lieu of a machete, but only succeeded in snapping the tool in half. Not a chip flew off the statue. Not a dent appeared in its polished surface. The thing was so unspeakably weird that I did not even try to explain it to myself, but started calling McCree again. If it was a gag of some kind, he could explain it, but there was no answer to my shouts, other than the monotonous hum of that unseen dynamo. Instead of frightening me more, this weird discovery seemed to jerk me up short. Collecting my scattered wits, I started back-trailing myself to the camp, thinking McCree might have returned in my absence. The droning noise was so loud now, it pained my eardrums unless I kept my hands over my ears. This I did, stumbling along with my eyes glued to my own footprints in the hard, dry sand. And suddenly, I brought up short. Directly ahead of me, under a black stone bush, lay something that made me gape with my mouth ajar. I can't describe it. No one could. It resembled nothing so much as a star-shaped blob of transparent jelly that shimmered and changed colour like an opal. It appeared to be some lower form of animal, one-celled, not large, only about a foot in circumference when it stretched those feelers out to full length. It oozed along over the sand like a snail, groping its way with those star points, and it hummed. The droning noise ringing in my ears issued from this nightmare creature. It was nauseating to watch, and yet beautiful too, with all those iridescent colours gleaming against that setting of dead black stone. I approached within a pace of it, started to nudge it with my foot, but couldn't quite bring myself to touch the squashy thing, and I've thanked my stars ever since for being so squeamish. Instead, I took off my flying helmet and tossed the goggles directly in the path of the creature. It did not pause or turn aside, but merely reached out one of those sickening feelers and brushed the goggles very lightly. And they turned to stone. Just that. God be my witness that those leather and glass goggles grew black before my starting eyes. In less than a minute, they were petrified into hard fuliginous rock like everything else around me. In one hideous moment, I realized the meaning of that weirdly lifelike statue of McCree. I knew what he had done. He had prodded this jelly-like thing with his automatic, and it had turned him, and everything in contact with him, into shiny dark stone. Nausea overcame me. I wanted to run, to escape the sight of that oozing horror, but reason came to my rescue. I reminded myself that I was Paul Kennicott, intrepid explorer. Through a horrible experience, McCree and I had stumbled upon something in the Brazilian wilds which would revolutionize the civilized world. McCree was dead, or in some ghastly suspended form of life, through his efforts to solve the mystery. I owed it to him and to myself not to lose my head now, for the practical possibilities of the thing struck me like a blow. That black stone the creature's touch created from any earth substance, by rays from its body, by a secretion of its glands, by God knows what strange metamorphosis, was indestructible. Bridges, houses, buildings, roads could be built of ordinary material, and then petrified by the touch of this jelly-like thing, which had surely tumbled from some planet with life forces diametrically opposed to our own. Millions of dollars squandered on construction each year could be diverted to other phases of life, for no cyclone or flood could damage a city built of this hard black rock. I said a little prayer for my martyred co-pilot, and then and there resolved to take the creature back to civilization with me. It could be trapped, I was sure, though the prospect appealed to me far less than that of caging a hungry leopard. I did not venture to try it until I had studied the problem from every angle, however, and made certain deductions through experiment. I found that any substance already petrified was insulated against the thing's power. I tossed my belt on it, saw it freeze into black rock, then put my wristwatch in contact with the rock belt. My watch remained as it was. Another phenomenon I discovered was that petrifaction also occurred in things in direct contact with something the creature touched, if that something was not already petrified. Dropping my glove, fastened to my signet ring, I let the creature touch only the glove, but both objects were petrified. I tried it again with a chain of 3 objects, and discovered that the touched object and the one in contact with it turned into black rock, while the third on the chain remained unaffected. It took me about 3 days to trap the thing, although it gave no more actual resistance, of course, than a large snail. McCree, poor devil, had blundered into the business, but I went at it in a scientific manner, knowing what danger I faced from the creature. I found my way again to our camp and brought back our provision box. Yes, the one there on the bed beside you. When the thing's touch had turned it into a perfect stone cage for itself, I scooped it inside with petrified branches. But, Lord, how the sweat stood out on my face at the prospect of a slip that might make me touch the horrible little organism. The trip out of that jungle was a nightmare. I spent almost all I had hiring scared natives to guide me a mile or so before they'd bolt with terror of my humming box. On board a tramp steamer bound for the States, I nearly lost my captive. The first mate thought it was an infernal machine and tried to throw it overboard. My last cent went to shut him up, so I landed in New York, flat broke. Paul Kennicott laughed and spread his hands. But here I am. I don't dare go to anyone I know just yet. Reporters will run me ragged, and I want plenty of time to make the right contacts. Do you realize what's in that box? He grinned with boyish delight. Fame and fortune, that's what. McCree's family will never know want again. Science will remember our names, along with Edison and Bell and all the rest. We've discovered a new force that will rock the world with its possibilities. That's why, he explained, I've sneaked into the country like an alien. If the wrong people heard of this first, my life wouldn't be worth a dime, understand? There are millions involved in this thing. Billions, don't you see? He stopped, eyeing me anxiously. I stared at him and rose slowly from the bed. Thoughts were seething in my mind, dark, ugly thoughts ebbing and flowing to the sound of that that filled the shabby room. For I did see the possibilities of that jelly-like thing's power to turn any object into black stone. But I was thinking, as a sculptor, what do I care for roads or buildings? Sculpture is my whole life. To my mind's eye rose the picture of co-pilot McCree, as Kennicott had described him, a figure, perfect to the last detail, done in black stone. Kennicott was still eyeing me anxiously, perhaps reading the ugly thoughts that flitted like shadows behind my eyes. You'll keep mum, he begged. Do that for me, old boy, and I'll set you up in a studio beyond your wildest dreams. I'll build up your fame as... What are you? His grey eyes. You're insane. I'm going to call the police. They'll find out what really happened to McCree out there in the jungle. There's nothing in that box. It's just a trick. Kennicott's mouth fell open, then closed in an angry line. The next moment, he shrugged and laughed. Of course you don't believe me, he nodded. Who could, unless they had seen what I've seen with my own eyes? Here, he said briskly. I'll take this book and drop it in the box for you. You'll see the creature, and you'll see this book turned into black stone. I stepped back, heart pounding, eyes narrowed. Kennicott leaned over the bed, unfastened the box gingerly with a wary expression on his face, and motioned me to approach. Briefly, I glanced over his shoulder as he dropped the book inside the open box. I saw horror, a jelly-like, opalescent thing, like a 5-pointed star. It pulsed and quivered for an instant, and the room fairly rocked to the unmuffled sound of that vibrant humming. I also saw the small cloth-bound book Kennicott had dropped inside. It lay half on top of the squirming creature, a book carved out of black stone. There, you see? Kennicott pointed. And those were the last words he ever uttered. Remembering what he had said about the power of the creature being unable to penetrate to a third object, I snatched at Kennicott's sleeve-covered arm, gave him a violent shove, and saw his muscular hand plunge for an instant deep into the black box. The sleeve hardened beneath my fingers. I cowered back, sickened at what I had done. Paul Kennicott, his arms thrown out and horror stamped on his fine young face, had frozen into a statue of black shiny stone. Then, footsteps were clumping up the stairs again. I realized that Mrs. Bates would surely have heard the violent droning that issued from the open box. I shut it swiftly, muffled it, and shoved it under the bed. I was at my own doorway when the landlady came puffing up the stairs. My face was calm, my voice contained, and no one but me could hear the furious pounding of my heart. Now you look a here, Mrs. Bates burst out. I told you to turn that radio off. You take it right out of my room this minute, running up my bill for electricity. I apologized meekly, and with a great show, carried out a tool case of mine, saying it was the portable radio I had been testing for a friend. It satisfied her for the moment, but later, as I was carrying the black stone figure of Paul Kennicott to my own room, she caught me at it. "Why," the old snoop exclaimed, "if that ain't the spittin' image of our new roomer. Friend of yours, is he?" I thought swiftly and lied jauntily. "A model of mine. I've been working on this statue at night, the reason you haven't seen him going in and out. I thought I would have to rent a room for him here, but as the statue is finished now, it won't be necessary after all. You may keep the rent money, though," I added, "and get me a taxi to haul my masterpiece to the express station. I am ready to submit it to the Museum of Fine Arts." And that is my story, gentlemen. The black stone statue, which, ironically, I chose to call Fear of the Unknown, is not a product of my skill. Small wonder several people have noticed its resemblance to the lost explorer Paul Kennicott. Nor did I do the group of soldiers commissioned by the Anti-War Association. None of my so-called symphonies in black were wrought by my hand. But I can tell you what became of the models who were unfortunate enough to pose for me. My real work is perhaps no better than that of a rank novice, although, up to that fatal afternoon, I had honestly believed myself capable of great work as a sculptor some day. But I am an impostor. You want a statue of me, you say, in your cablegram, done in the mysterious black stone which has made me so famous? Ah, gentlemen, you shall have that statue. I am writing this confession aboard the SS Madrigal, and I shall leave it with a steward to be mailed to you at our next port of call. Tonight, I shall take out of my stateroom the hideous thing in its black box which has never left my side. Such a creature, contrary to all nature on this earth of ours, should be exterminated. As soon as darkness falls, I shall stand on deck and balance the box on the rail so that it will fall into the sea after my hand has touched what is inside. I wonder if the process of being turned into that black rock is painful, or if it is accompanied only by a feeling of lethargy. And Macri, Paul Kennicott, and those unfortunate models whom I have passed off as my work, are they dead, as we know death, or are their statues sentient and possessed of nerves? How does that jelly creature feel to the touch? Does it impart a violent electrical shock, or a subtle emanation of some force beyond our ken, changing the atomic structure of the flesh it turns into stone? Many such questions have occurred to me often in the small hours when I lie awake, tortured by remorse for what I have done. But tonight, gentlemen, I shall know all the answers.
The Ensouled Violin by Helena Blavatsky. 1. In the year 1828, an old German, a music teacher, came to Paris with his pupil and settled unostentatiously in one of the quiet faubourgs of the metropolis. The first rejoiced in the name of Samuel Klaus. The second answered to the more poetical appellation of Franz Steenio. The younger man was a violinist, gifted, as rumour went, with extraordinary, almost miraculous talent. Yet as he was poor and had not hitherto made a name for himself in Europe, he remained for several years in the capital of France, the heart and pulse of capricious continental fashion, unknown and unappreciated. Franz was a Styrian by birth, and at the time of the event to be presently described, he was a young man considerably under 30, a philosopher and a dreamer by nature, imbued with all the mystic oddities of true genius. He reminded one of some of the heroes in Hoffmann's Conte Fantastique. His earlier existence had been a very unusual, in fact, quite an eccentric one, and its history must be briefly told, for the better understanding of the present story. Born of very pious country people, in a quiet burg among the Styrian Alps, nursed by the native gnomes who watched over his cradle, growing up in the weird atmosphere of the ghouls and vampires who play such a prominent part in the household of every Styrian and Slavonian in southern Austria, educated later as a student in the shadow of the old Rhenish castles of Germany. Friends from his childhood had passed through every emotional stage on the plane of the so-called supernatural. He had also studied at one time the occult arts with an enthusiastic disciple of Paracelsus and Conrath. Alchemy had few theoretical secrets for him, and he had dabbled in ceremonial magic and sorcery with some Hungarian Zagans. Yet he loved above all else music, and above music, his violin. At the age of 22, he suddenly gave up his practical studies in the occult, and from that day, though as devoted as ever in thought to the beautiful Grecian gods, he surrendered himself entirely to his art. Of his classic studies, he had retained only that which related to the Muses, Euterpe especially, at whose altar he worshipped, and Orpheus, whose magic lyre he tried to emulate with his violin. Except his dreamy belief in the nymphs and the sirens, on account probably of the double relationship of the latter to the Muses, through Calliope and Orpheus, he was interested but little in the matters of this sublunary world. All his aspirations mounted, like incense, with the wave of the heavenly harmony that he drew from his instrument to a higher and a nobler sphere. He dreamed awake and lived a real though an enchanted life only during those hours when his magic bow carried him along the wave of sound to the pagan Olympus, to the feet of Euterpe. A strange child he had ever been in his own home, where tales of magic and witchcraft grow out of every inch of the soil. A still stranger boy he had become, until finally he had blossomed into manhood, without one single characteristic of youth. Never had a fair face attracted his attention. Not for one moment had his thoughts turned from his solitary studies to a life beyond that of a mystic bohemian. Content with his own company, he had thus passed the best years of his youth and manhood, with his violin for his chief idol, and with the gods and goddesses of old Greece for his audience, in perfect ignorance of practical life. His whole existence had been one long day of dreams, of melody and sunlight, and he had never felt any other aspirations. How useless, but oh, how glorious those dreams! How vivid, and why should he desire any better fate? Was he not all that he wanted to be, transformed in a second of thought into one or another hero, from Orpheus, who held all nature breathless, to the urchin who piped away under the plane tree, to the naiads of Callirrhoe's crystal fountain? Did not the swift-footed nymphs frolic at his beck and call to the sound of the magic flute of the Arcadian shepherd, who was himself, behold, the goddess of love and beauty herself, descending from on high, attracted by the sweet-voiced notes of his violin? Yet there came a time when he preferred Syrinx to Aphrodite, not as the fair nymph pursued by Pan, but after her transformation by the merciful gods into the reed, out of which the frustrated god of the shepherds had made his magic pipe. For also, with time, ambition grows and is rarely satisfied. When he tried to emulate on his violin the enchanting sounds that resounded in his mind, the whole of Parnassus kept silent under the spell, or joined in heavenly chorus, but the audience he finally craved was composed of more than the gods sung by Hesiod, verily of the most appreciative meloman of European capitals. He felt jealous of the magic pipe, and would fain have had it at his command. "Oh, that I could allure a nymph into my beloved violin!" he often cried, after awakening from one of his daydreams. "Oh, that I could only span in spirit flight the abyss of time! Oh, that I could find myself for one short day a partaker of the secret arts of the gods, a god myself, in the sight and hearing of enraptured humanity, and, having learned the mystery of the lyre of Orpheus, was secured within my violin a siren, thereby benefit mortals to my own glory." Thus, having for long years dreamed in the company of the gods of his fancy, he now took to dreaming of the transitory glories of fame upon this earth. But at this time he was suddenly called home by his widowed mother from one of the German universities, where he had lived for the last year or two. This was an event which brought his plans to an end, at least so far as the immediate future was concerned, for he had hitherto drawn upon her alone for his meagre pittance, and his means were not sufficient for an independent life outside his native place. His return had a very unexpected result. His mother, whose only love he was on earth, died soon after she had welcomed her Benjamin back, and the good wives of the Burg exercised their swift tongues for many a month after as to the real causes of that death. Frau Steenio, before Franz's return, was a healthy, buxom, middle-aged body, strong and hearty. She was a pious and a God-fearing soul, too, who had never failed in saying her prayers, nor had missed an early Mass for years during his absence. On the first Sunday after her son had settled at home, a day that she had been longing for and had anticipated for months in joyous visions, in which she saw him kneeling by her side in the little church on the hill, she called him from the foot of the stairs. The hour had come when her pious dream was to be realized, and she was waiting for him, carefully wiping the dust from the prayer book he had used in his boyhood. But instead of Franz, it was his violin that responded to her call, mixing its sonorous voice with the rather cracked tones of the peal of the merry Sunday bells. The fond mother was somewhat shocked at hearing the prayer-inspiring sounds drowned by the weird, fantastic notes of the Dance of the Witches. They seemed to her so unearthly and mocking, but she almost fainted upon hearing the definite refusal of her well-beloved son to go to church. He never went to church, he coolly remarked. It was loss of time. Besides which, the loud peals of the old church organ jarred on his nerves. Nothing should induce him to submit to the torture of listening to that cracked organ. He was firm, and nothing could move him. To her supplications and remonstrances, he put an end by offering to play for her a Hymn to the Sun he had just composed. From that memorable Sunday morning, Frau Steenio lost her usual serenity of mind. She hastened to lay her sorrows and seek for consolation at the foot of the confessional, but that which she heard in response from the stem priest filled her gentle and unsophisticated soul with dismay and almost with despair. A feeling of fear, a sense of profound terror, which soon became a chronic state with her, pursued her from that moment. Her nights became disturbed and sleepless. Her days passed in prayer and lamentations. In her maternal anxiety for the salvation of her beloved son's soul and for his post-mortem welfare, she made a series of rash vows. Finding that neither the Latin petition to the Mother of God written for her by her spiritual adviser, nor yet the humble supplications in German addressed by herself to every saint she had reason to believe was residing in paradise, worked the desired effect, she took to pilgrimages to distant shrines. During one of these journeys to a holy chapel situated high up in the mountains, she caught cold amidst the glaciers of the Tyrol, and redescended only to take to a sick bed from which she arose no more. Frau Steenio's vow had led her, in one sense, to the desired result. The poor woman was now given an opportunity of seeking out in propria persona the saint she had believed in so well, and of pleading face to face for the recreant son who refused adherence to them and to the church, scoffed at monk and confessional, and held the organ in such horror. Franz sincerely lamented his mother's death. Unaware of being the indirect cause of it, he felt no remorse, but, selling the modest household goods and chattels, light in purse and heart, he resolved to travel on foot for a year or two before settling down to any definite profession. A hazy desire to see the great cities of Europe and to try his luck in France lurked at the bottom of his travelling project, but his bohemian habits of life were too strong to be abruptly abandoned. He placed his small capital with a banker for a rainy day, and started on his pedestrian journey via Germany and Austria. His violin paid for his board and lodging in the inns and farms on his way, and he passed his days in the green fields and in the solemn, silent woods, face to face with nature, dreaming all the time as usual with his eyes open. During the 3 months of his pleasant travels to and fro, he never descended for one moment from Parnassus, but, as an alchemist transmutes lead into gold, so he transformed everything on his way into a song of Hesiod or Anacreon. Every evening, while fiddling for his supper and bed, whether on a green lawn or in the hall of a rustic inn, his fancy changed the whole scene for him. Village swains and maidens became transfigured into Arcadian shepherds and nymphs. The sand-covered floor was now a green sward, the uncouth couples spinning round in a measured waltz with the wild grace of tamed bears became priests and priestesses of terpsichore. The bulky, cherry-cheeked and blue-eyed daughters of rural Germany were the Hesperides circling round the trees laden with the golden apples. Nor did the melodious strains of the Arcadian demigods piping on their syrinxes and audible but to his own enchanted ear vanish with the dawn. For no sooner was the curtain of sleep raised from his eyes than he would sally forth into a new magic realm of daydreams. On his way to some dark and solemn pine forest, he played incessantly to himself and to everything else. He fiddled to the green hill, and forthwith the mountain and the moss-covered rocks moved forward to hear him the better, as they had done at the sound of the Orphean lyre. He fiddled to the merry-voiced brook, to the hurrying river, and both slackened their speed and stopped their waves, and, becoming silent, seemed to listen to him in an entranced rapture. Even the long-legged stork, who stood meditatively on one leg on the thatched top of the rustic mill, gravely resolving unto himself the problem of his too long existence, sent out after him a long and strident cry, screeching, "Art thou Orpheus himself, O Sthenio?" It was a period of full bliss, of a daily and almost hourly exaltation. The last words of his dying mother, whispering to him of the horrors of eternal condemnation, had left him unaffected, and the only vision her warning evoked in him was that of Pluto. By a ready association of ideas, he saw the lord of the dark nether kingdom greeting him as he had greeted the husband of Eurydice before him. Charmed with the magic sounds of his violin, the wheel of Ixion was at a standstill once more, thus affording relief to the wretched seducer of Juno, and giving the lie to those who claim eternity for the duration of the punishment of condemned sinners. He perceived Tantalus forgetting his never-ceasing thirst, and smacking his lips as he drank in the heaven-born melody. The stone of Sisyphus becoming motionless, the Furies themselves smiling on him, and the sovereign of the gloomy regions delighted, and awarding preference to his violin over the lyre of Orpheus. Taken au sérieux, mythology thus seems a decided antidote to fear in the face of theological threats, especially when strengthened with an insane and passionate love of music. With Franz, Euterpe proved always victorious in every contest, aye, even with hell itself. But there is an end to everything, and very soon Franz had to give up uninterrupted dreaming. He had reached the university town where dwelt his old violin teacher, Samuel Klaus. When this antiquated musician found that his beloved and favorite pupil, Franz, had been left poor in purse and still poorer in earthly affections, he felt his strong attachment to the boy awaken with tenfold force. He took Franz to his heart and forthwith adopted him as his son. The old teacher reminded people of one of those grotesque figures which look as if they had just stepped out of some medieval panel, and yet Klaus, with his fantastic allure of a night goblin, had the most loving heart, as tender as that of a woman, and the self-sacrificing nature of an old Christian martyr. When Franz had briefly narrated to him the history of his last few years, the professor took him by the hand, and leading him into his studies, simply said, "Stop with me, and put an end to your bohemian life. Make yourself famous. I am old and childless, and will be your father. Let us live together, and forget all save fame." And forthwith he offered to proceed with Franz to Paris, via several large German cities where they would stop to give concerts. In a few days, Klaus succeeded in making Franz forget his vagrant life and its artistic independence, and reawakened in his pupil his now dormant ambition and desire for worldly fame. Hitherto, since his mother's death, he had been content to receive applause only from the gods and goddesses who inhabited his vivid fancy. Now he began to crave once more for the admiration of mortals. Under the clever and careful training of old Klaus, his remarkable talent gained in strength and powerful charm with every day, and his reputation grew and expanded with every city and town wherein he made himself heard. His ambition was being rapidly realized. The presiding genii of various musical centers, to whose patronage his talent was submitted, soon proclaimed him the one violinist of the day, and the public declared loudly that he stood unrivaled by anyone whom they had ever heard. These laudations very soon made both master and pupil completely lose their heads. But Paris was less ready with such appreciation. Paris makes reputations for itself and will take none on faith. They had been living in it for almost 3 years, and were still climbing with difficulty the artist's Calvary, when an event occurred which put an end even to their most modest expectations. The first arrival of Niccolo Paganini was suddenly heralded, and threw Lutetia into a convulsion of expectation. The unparalleled artist arrived, and all Paris fell at once at his feet. 2. Now, it is a well-known fact that a superstition born in the dark days of medieval superstition, and surviving almost to the middle of the present century, attributed all such abnormal, out-of-the-way talent as that of Paganini to supernatural agency. Every great and marvelous artist had been accused in his day of dealings with the devil. A few instances will suffice to refresh the reader's memory. Tartini, the great composer and violinist of the 17th century, was denounced as one who got his best inspirations from the evil one, with whom he was, it was said, in regular league. This accusation, of course, was due to the almost magical impression he produced upon his audiences. His inspired performance on the violin secured for him in his native country the title of Master of Nations. The Sonnet du Diable, also called Tartini's Dream, as everyone who has heard it will be ready to testify, is the most weird melody ever heard or invented. Hence, the marvelous composition has become the source of endless legends. Nor were they entirely baseless, since it was he himself who was shown to have originated them. Tartini confessed to having written it on awakening from a dream, in which he had heard his sonata performed by Satan for his benefit, and in consequence of a bargain made with his infernal majesty. Several famous singers, even, whose exceptional voices struck the hearers with superstitious admiration, have not escaped a like accusation. Pasta's splendid voice was attributed in her day to the fact that 3 months before her birth, the diva's mother was carried during a trance to heaven, and there treated to a vocal concert of seraphs. Malibran was indebted for her voice to Saint Cecilia, while others said she owed it to a demon who watched over her cradle and sung the baby to sleep. Finally, Paganini, the unrivaled performer, the mean Italian, who, like Dryden's Jubal striking on the corded shell, forced the throngs that followed him to worship the divine sounds produced, and made people say that less than a god could not dwell within the hollow of his violin. Paganini left a legend too. The almost supernatural art of the greatest violin player that the world has ever known was often speculated upon, never understood. The effect produced by him on his audience was literally marvelous, overpowering. The great Rossini is said to have wept like a sentimental German maiden on hearing him play for the first time. The Princess Eliza of Lucca, a sister of the great Napoleon, in whose service Paganini was, as director of her private orchestra, for a long time was unable to hear him play without fainting. In women he produced nervous fits and hysterics at his will. Stout-hearted men he drove to frenzy. He changed cowards into heroes, and made the bravest soldiers feel like so many nervous schoolgirls. Is it to be wondered at, then, that hundreds of weird tales circulated for long years about and around the mysterious Genoese, that modern Orpheus of Europe? One of these was especially ghastly. It was rumored, and was believed by more people than would probably like to confess it, that the strings of his violin were made of human intestines, according to all the rules and requirements of the black art. Exaggerated as this idea may seem to some, it has nothing impossible in it, and it is more than probable that it was this legend that led to the extraordinary events which we are about to narrate. Human organs are often used by the Eastern black magicians, so-called, and it is an averred fact that some Bengali tantrikas, reciters of tantras or invocations to the demon, as a reverend writer has described them, use human corpses and certain internal and external organs pertaining to them as powerful magical agents for bad purposes. However this may be, now that the magnetic and mesmeric potencies of hypnotism are recognized as facts by most physicians, it may be suggested, with less danger than heretofore, that the extraordinary effects of Paganini's violin playing were not, perhaps, entirely due to his talent and genius. The wonder and awe he so easily excited were as much caused by his external appearance, which had something weird and demoniacal in it, according to certain of his biographers, as by the inexpressible charm of his execution and his remarkable mechanical skill. The latter is demonstrated by his perfect imitation of the flageolet and his performance of long and magnificent melodies on the G-string alone. In this performance, which many an artist has tried to copy without success, he remains unrivaled to this day. It is owing to this remarkable appearance of his, termed by his friends eccentric, and by his two nervous victims diabolical, that he experienced great difficulties in refuting certain ugly rumours. These were credited far more easily in his day than they would be now. It was whispered throughout Italy, and even in his own native town, that Paganini had murdered his wife, and, later on, a mistress, both of whom he had loved passionately, and both of whom he had not hesitated to sacrifice to his fiendish ambition. He had made himself proficient in magic arts, it was asserted, and had succeeded thereby in imprisoning the souls of his two victims in his violin, his famous Cremona. It is maintained by the immediate friends of Ernst T.W. Hoffmann, the celebrated author of Die Elixire des Teufels, Meister Martin, and other charming and mysterious tales, that Councillor Crespel, in the violin of Cremona, was taken from the legend about Paganini. It is, as all who have read it know, the history of a celebrated violin, into which the voice and the soul of a famous diva, a woman whom Crespel had loved and killed, had passed, and to which was added the voice of his beloved daughter, Antonia. Nor was the superstition utterly ungrounded, nor was Hoffmann to be blamed for adopting it, after he had heard Paganini's playing. The extraordinary facility with which the artist drew out of his instrument not only the most unearthly sounds, but positively human voices, justified the suspicion. Such effects might well have startled an audience and thrown terror into many a nervous heart. Add to this the impenetrable mystery connected with a certain period of Paganini's youth, and the most wild tales about him must be found in a measure justifiable and even excusable, especially among a nation whose ancestors knew the Borgias and the Medicis of black art fame. 3. In those pre-telegraphic days, newspapers were limited, and the wings of fame had a heavier flight than they have now. Franz had hardly heard of Paganini, and when he did, he swore he would rival, if not eclipse, the Genoese magician. Yes, he would either become the most famous of all living violinists, or he would break his instrument and put an end to his life at the same time. Old Klaus rejoiced at such a determination. He rubbed his hands in glee, and, jumping about on his lame leg like a crippled satyr, he flattered and incensed his pupil, believing himself all the while to be performing a sacred duty to the holy and majestic cause of art. Upon first setting foot in Paris, 3 years before, Franz had all but failed. Musical critics pronounced him a rising star, but had all agreed that he required a few more years' practice before he could hope to carry his audiences by storm. Therefore, after a desperate study of over 2 years and uninterrupted preparations, the Styrian artist had finally made himself ready for his first serious appearance in the great opera house, where a public concert before the most exacting critics of the old world was to be held. At this critical moment, Paganini's arrival in the European metropolis placed an obstacle in the way of the realization of his hopes, and the old German professor wisely postponed his pupil's debut. At first he had simply smiled at the wild enthusiasm, the laudatory hymns sung about the Genoese violinist, and the almost superstitious awe with which his name was pronounced. But very soon Paganini's name became a burning iron in the hearts of both the artists, and a threatening phantom in the mind of Klaus. A few days more, and they shuddered at the very mention of their great rival, whose success became with every night more unprecedented. The first series of concerts was over, but neither Klaus nor Franz had as yet had an opportunity of hearing him and of judging for themselves. So great and so beyond their means was the charge for admission, and so small the hope of getting a free pass from a brother artist justly regarded as the meanest of men in monetary transactions, that they had to wait for a chance, as did so many others. But the day came when neither master nor pupil could control their impatience any longer, so they pawned their watches and with the proceeds bought 2 modest seats. Who can describe the enthusiasm, the triumphs, of this famous and at the same time fatal night? The audience was frantic. Men wept and women screamed and fainted, while both Klaus and Steenio sat looking paler than 2 ghosts. At the first touch of Paganini's magic bow, both Franz and Samuel felt as if the icy hand of death had touched them. Carried away by an irresistible enthusiasm, which turned into a violent, unearthly mental torture, they dared neither look into each other's faces nor exchange one word during the whole performance. At midnight, while the chosen delegates of the musical societies and the Conservatory of Paris unhitched the horses and dragged the carriage of the grand artist home in triumph, the 2 Germans returned to their modest lodging, and it was a pitiful sight to see them. Mournful and desperate, they placed themselves in their usual seats at the fire corner, and neither for a while opened his mouth. "Samuel!" at last exclaimed Franz, pale as death itself. "Samuel, it remains for us now but to die. Do you hear me? We are worthless. We were 2 madmen to have ever hoped that anyone in this world would ever rival him." The name of Paganini stuck in his throat, as in utter despair he fell into his armchair. The old professor's wrinkles suddenly became purple. His little greenish eyes gleamed phosphorescently as, bending towards his pupil, he whispered to him in hoarse and broken tones, "9, 9! Thou art wrong, my Franz. I have taught thee, and thou hast learned all of the great art that a simple mortal and a Christian by baptism can learn from another simple mortal. Am I to blame because these accursed Italians, in order to reign unequalled in the domain of art, have recourse to Satan and the diabolical effects of black magic?" Franz turned his eyes upon his old master. There was a sinister light burning in those glittering orbs, a light telling plainly that to secure such a power he, too, would not scruple to sell himself, body and soul, to the evil one. But he said not a word, and, turning his eyes from his old master's face, gazed dreamily at the dying embers. The same long-forgotten incoherent dreams, which, after seeming such realities to him in his younger days, had been given up entirely, and had gradually faded from his mind, now crowded back into it with the same force and vividness as of old. The grimacing shades of Ixion, Sisyphus, and Tantalus resurrected and stood before him, saying, "What matters hell, in which thou believest not? And even if hell there be, it is the hell described by the old Greeks, not that of the modern bigots, a locality full of conscious shadows, to whom thou canst be a second Orpheus." Franz felt that he was going mad, and, turning instinctively, he looked his old master once more right in the face. Then his bloodshot eye evaded the gaze of Klaus. Whether Samuel understood the terrible state of mind of his pupil, or whether he wanted to draw him out, to make him speak, and thus to divert his thoughts, must remain as hypothetical to the reader as it is to the writer. Whatever may have been in his mind, the German enthusiast went on, speaking with a feigned calmness. "Franz, my dear boy, I tell you that the art of the accursed Italian is not natural, that it is due neither to study nor to genius. It never was acquired in the usual natural way. You need not stare at me in that wild manner, for what I say is in the mouth of millions of people. Listen to what I now tell you, and try to understand. You have heard the strange tale whispered about the famous Tartini. He died one fine Sabbath night, strangled by his familiar demon, who had taught him how to endow his violin with a human voice, by shutting up in it, by means of incantations, the soul of a young virgin. Paganini did more. In order to endow his instrument with the faculty of emitting human sounds, such as sobs, despairing cries, supplications, moans of love and fury, in short, the most heart-rending notes of the human voice, Paganini became the murderer not only of his wife and his mistress, but also of a friend who was more tenderly attached to him than any other being on this earth. He then made the 4 chords of his magic violin out of the intestines of his last victim. This is the secret of his enchanting talent, of that overpowering melody, that combination of sounds, which you will never be able to master unless— The old man could not finish the sentence. He staggered back before the fiendish look of his pupil and covered his face with his hands. Franz was breathing heavily, and his eyes had an expression which reminded Klaus of those of a hyena. His pallor was cadaverous. For some time he could not speak, but only gasped for breath. At last he slowly muttered, "Are you in earnest?" "I am, as I hope to help you." And do you really believe that had I only the means of obtaining human intestines for strings, I could rival Paganini?" asked Franz, after a moment's pause, and casting down his eyes. The old German unveiled his face, and, with a strange look of determination upon it, softly answered, "Human intestines alone are not sufficient for our purpose. They must have belonged to someone who had loved us well, with an unselfish, holy love. Tartini endowed his violin with the life of a virgin, but that virgin had died of unrequited love for him. The fiendish artist had prepared beforehand a tube, in which he managed to catch her last breath as she expired, pronouncing his beloved name, and he then transferred this breath to his violin. As to Paganini, I have just told you his tale. It was with the consent of his victim, though, that he murdered him to get possession of his intestines." "Oh, for the power of the human voice," Samuel went on, after a brief pause. "What can equal the eloquence, the magic spell of the human voice? Do you think, my poor boy, I would not have taught you this final secret, were it not that it throws one right into the clutches of him who must remain unnamed at night?" he added, with a sudden return to the superstitions of his youth. Franz did not answer, but with a calmness awful to behold, he left his place, took down his violin from the wall where it was hanging, and, with one powerful grasp of the cords, he tore them out and flung them into the fire. Samuel suppressed a cry of horror. The cords were hissing upon the coals, where, among the blazing logs, they wriggled and curled like so many living snakes. "By the witches of Thessaly and the dark arts of Circe!" he exclaimed with foaming mouth and his eyes burning like coals. "By the furies of hell and Pluto himself, I now swear in thy presence, O Samuel, my master, never to touch a violin again until I can string it with 4 human chords. May I be accursed for ever and ever if I do." He fell senseless on the floor, with a deep sob that ended like a funeral wail. Old Samuel lifted him up as he would have lifted a child, and carried him to his bed. Then he sallied forth in search of a physician. 4. For several days after this painful scene, Franz was very ill almost beyond recovery. The physician declared him to be suffering from brain fever, and said that the worst was to be feared. For 9 long days the patient remained delirious, and Klaus, who was nursing him night and day with the solicitude of the tenderest mother, was horrified at the work of his own hands. For the first time since their acquaintance began, the old teacher, owing to the wild ravings of his pupil, was able to penetrate into the darkest corners of that weird, superstitious, cold, and at the same time passionate nature, and he trembled at what he discovered. For he saw that which he had failed to perceive before, Franz as he was in reality, and not as he seemed to superficial observers. Music was the life of the young man, and adulation was the air he breathed, without which that life became a burden. From the chords of his violin alone, Steinio drew his life and being, but the applause of men and even of gods was necessary to its support. He saw unveiled before his eyes a genuine, artistic, earthly soul, with its divine counterpart totally absent, a son of the muses, all fancy and brain poetry, but without a heart. While listening to the ravings of that delirious and unhinged fancy, Klaus felt as if he were for the first time in his long life exploring a marvelous and untraveled region, a human nature not of this world, but of some incomplete planet. He saw all this, and shuddered. More than once he asked himself whether it would not be doing a kindness to his boy to let him die before he returned to consciousness, but he loved his pupil too well to dwell for long on such an idea. Franz had betwixt his truly artistic nature, and now old Klaus felt as though their two lives were inseparably linked together. That he could thus feel was a revelation to the old man, so he decided to save Franz, even at the expense of his own old and, as he thought, useless life. The 7th day of the illness brought on a most terrible crisis. For 24 hours the patient never closed his eyes, nor remained for a moment silent. He raved continuously during the whole time. His visions were peculiar, and he minutely described each. Fantastic, ghastly figures kept slowly swimming out of the penumbra of his small, dark room, in regular and uninterrupted procession, and he greeted each by name as he might greet old acquaintances. He referred to himself as Prometheus, bound to the rock by 4 bands made of human intestines. At the foot of the Caucasian Mount, the black waters of the river Styx were running. They had deserted Arcadia, and were now endeavoring to encircle within a 7-fold embrace the rock upon which he was suffering. "Wouldst thou know the name of the Promethean rock, old man?" he roared into his adopted father's ear. "Listen, then. Its name is called Samuel Klaus." "Yes, yes," the German murmured disconsolately. "It is I who killed him, while seeking to console. The news of Paganini's magic arts struck his fancy too vividly. Oh, my poor, poor boy." The patient broke into a loud and discordant laugh. "Aye, poor old man, sayest thou? So, thou art of poor stuff anyhow, and wouldst look well only when stretched upon a fine Cremona violin." Klaus shuddered, but said nothing. He only bent over the poor maniac, and with a kiss upon his brow, a caress as tender and as gentle as that of a doting mother, he left the sick room for a few instants to seek relief in his own garret. When he returned, the ravings were following another channel. Franz was singing, trying to imitate the sounds of a violin. Toward the evening of that day, the delirium of the sick man became perfectly ghastly. He saw spirits of fire clutching at his violin. Their skeleton hands, from each finger of which grew a flaming claw, beckoned to old Samuel. They approached and surrounded the old master, and were preparing to rip him open. Him, the only man on this earth who loves me with an unselfish, holy love, and whose intestines can be of any good at all, he went on whispering, with glaring eyes and demon laugh. By the next morning, however, the fever had disappeared, and by the end of the 9th day, Steenio had left his bed, having no recollection of his illness, and no suspicion that he had allowed Klaus to read his inner thought. Nay, had he himself any knowledge that such a horrible idea as the sacrifice of his old master to his ambition had ever entered his mind? Hardly. The only immediate result of his fatal illness was that as, by reason of his vow, his artistic passion could find no issue, another passion awoke which might avail to feed his ambition and his insatiable fancy. He plunged headlong into the study of the occult arts, of alchemy, and of magic. In the practice of magic, the young dreamer sought to stifle the voice of his passionate longing for his, as he thought, forever lost violin. Weeks and months passed away, and the conversation about Paganini was never resumed between the master and the pupil. But a profound melancholy had taken possession of Franz. The two hardly exchanged a word. The violin hung mute, cordless, full of dust, in its habitual place. It was as the presence of a soulless corpse between them. The young man had become gloomy and sarcastic, even avoiding the mention of music. Once, as his old professor, after long hesitation, took out his own violin from its dust-covered case and prepared to play, Franz gave a convulsive shudder, but said nothing. At the first notes of the bow, however, he glared like a madman, and rushing out of the house, remained for hours, wandering in the streets. Then old Samuel in his turn threw his instrument down, and locked himself up in his room till the following morning. One night, as Franz sat, looking particularly pale and gloomy, old Samuel suddenly jumped from his seat, and after hopping about the room in a magpie fashion, approached his pupil, imprinted a fond kiss upon the young man's brow, and squeaked at the top of his shrill voice, "Is it not time to put an end to all this?" Whereupon, starting from his usual lethargy, Franz echoed, as in a dream, "Yes, it is time to put an end to this," upon which the two separated and went to bed. On the following morning, when Franz awoke, he was astonished not to see his old teacher in his usual place to greet him, but he had greatly altered during the last few months, and he at first paid no attention to his absence, unusual as it was. He dressed and went into the adjoining room, a little parlour where they had their meals, and which separated their 2 bedrooms. The fire had not been lighted since the embers had died out on the previous night, and no sign was anywhere visible of the professor's busy hand in his usual housekeeping duties. Greatly puzzled, but in no way dismayed, Franz took his usual place at the corner of the now cold fireplace and fell into an aimless reverie. As he stretched himself in his old armchair, raising both his hands to clasp them behind his head in a favourite posture of his hand came into contact with something on a shelf at his back. He knocked against a case and brought it violently on the ground. It was old Klaus's violin case that came down to the floor with such a sudden crash that the case opened and the violin fell out of it, rolling to the feet of Franz. And then the chords striking against the brass fender emitted a sound, prolonged, sad and mournful as the sigh of an unrestful soul. It seemed to fill the whole room and reverberated in the head and the very heart of the young man. The effect of that broken violin string was magical. "Samuel!" cried Steenio, with his eyes starting from their sockets, and an unknown terror suddenly taking possession of his whole being. "Samuel, what has happened? My dear old master!" he called out, hastening to the professor's little room, and throwing the door violently open. No one answered. All was silent within. He staggered back, frightened at the sound of his own voice, so changed and hoarse it seemed to him at this moment. No reply came in response to his call. Naught followed but a dead silence, that stillness which in the domain of sounds usually denotes death. In the presence of a corpse, as in the lugubrious stillness of a tomb, such silence acquires a mysterious power which strikes the sensitive soul with a nameless terror. The little room was dark, and Franz hastened to open the shutters. Samuel was lying on his bed, cold, stiff, and lifeless. At the sight of the corpse of him who had loved him so well, and had been to him more than a father, Franz experienced a dreadful revulsion of feeling, a terrible shock. But the ambition of the fanatical artist got the better of the despair of the man, and smothered the feelings of the latter in a few seconds. A note bearing his own name was conspicuously placed upon a table near the corpse. With trembling hand, the violinist tore open the envelope and read the following: "My beloved son, Franz. When you read this, I shall have made the greatest sacrifice that your best and only friend and teacher could have accomplished for your fame. He who loved you most is now but an inanimate lump of clay. Of your old teacher there now remains but a clod of cold organic matter. I need not prompt you as to what you have to do with it. Fear not stupid prejudices. It is for your future fame that I have made an offering of my body, and you would be guilty of the blackest ingratitude were you now to render useless this sacrifice. When you shall have replaced the chords upon your violin, and these chords a portion of my own self, under your touch it will acquire the power of that accursed sorcerer, all the magic voices of Paganini's instrument. You will find therein my voice, my sighs and groans, my song of welcome, the prayerful sobs of my infinite and sorrowful sympathy, my love for you. And now, my friends, fear nobody. Take your instrument with you, and dog the steps of him who filled our lives with bitterness and despair. Appear in every arena where hitherto he has reigned without a rival, and bravely throw the gauntlet of defiance in his face. O Franz, then only wilt thou hear with what a magic power the full notes of unselfish love will issue forth from thy violin. Perchance, with the last caressing touch of its chords, thou wilt remember that they once formed a portion of thine old teacher, who now embraces and blesses thee for the last time. Samuel. 2 burning tears sparkled in the eyes of Franz, but they dried up instantly. Under the fiery rush of passionate hope and pride, the 2 orbs of the future magician-artist, riveted to the ghastly face of the dead man, shone like the eyes of a demon. Our pen refuses to describe that which took place on that day, after the legal inquiry was over. As another note, written with a view of satisfying the authorities, had been prudently provided by the loving care of the old man, the verdict was suicide from causes unknown. After this, the coroner and the police retired, leaving the bereaved heir alone in the death room with the remains of that which had once been a living man. Scarcely a fortnight had elapsed from that day ere the violin had been dusted and 4 new, stout strings had been stretched upon it. Franz dared not look at them. He tried to play, but the bow trembled in his hand like a dagger in the grasp of a novice brigand. He then determined not to try again until the portentous night should arrive, when he should have a chance of rivaling, nay, of surpassing Paganini. The famous violinist had meanwhile left Paris, and was giving a series of triumphant concerts at an old Flemish town in Belgium. 5. One night, as Paganini, surrounded by a crowd of admirers, was sitting in the dining-room of the hotel at which he was staying, a visiting card with a few words written on it in pencil was handed to him by a young man with wild and staring eyes. Fixing upon the intruder a look which few persons could bear, but receiving back a glance as calm and determined as his own, Paganini slightly bowed, and then dryly said, "Sir, it shall be as you desire. Name the night. I am at your service." On the following morning the whole town was startled by the appearance of bills posted at the corner of every street, and bearing the strange notice, "On the night of blank, at the great theatre of blank, and for the first time, will appear before the public Franz Steenio, a German violinist, arrived purposely to throw down the gauntlet to the world-famous Paganini, and to challenge him to a duel upon their violins. He purposes to compete with the great virtuoso in the execution of the most difficult of his compositions. The famous Paganini has accepted the challenge. Franz Steenio will play, in competition with the unrivaled violinist, the celebrated Fantaisie Caprice of the latter, known as the Witches. The effect of the notice was magical. Paganini, who amid his greatest triumphs never lost sight of a profitable speculation, doubled the usual price of admission, but still the theatre could not hold the crowds that flocked to secure tickets for that memorable performance. At last the morning of the concert day dawned, and the jewel was in every one's mouth. Franz Steenio, who, instead of sleeping, had passed the whole long hours of the preceding midnight in walking up and down his room like an encaged panther, had, toward morning, fallen on his bed from mere physical exhaustion. Gradually he passed into a death-like and dreamless slumber. At the gloomy winter dawn he awoke, but finding it too early to rise, he fell asleep again, and then he had a vivid dream, so vivid indeed, so lifelike, that from its terrible realism he felt sure that it was a vision rather than a dream. He had left his violin on a table by his bedside, locked in its case, the key of which never left him. Since he had strung it with those terrible chords, he never let it out of his sight for a moment. In accordance with his resolution, he had not touched it since his first trial, and his bow had never but once touched the human strings, for he had since always practised on another instrument. But now in his sleep he saw something looking at the locked case. Something in it was attracting his attention, and he found himself incapable of detaching his eyes from it. Suddenly he saw the upper part of the case slowly rising, and within the chink thus produced he perceived 2 small phosphorescent green eyes but too familiar to him, fixing themselves on his lovingly, almost beseechingly. Then a thin, shrill voice, as if issuing from these ghastly orbs, the voice and orbs of Samuel Klaus himself, resounded in Steenio's horrified ear, and he heard it say, "Franz, my beloved boy, Franz, I
cannot separate myself from them."
And they twanged piteously inside the case. Franz stood speechless, horror-bound. He felt his blood actually freezing, and his hair moving and standing erect on his head. "It's but a dream, an empty dream," he attempted to formulate in his mind.
"I have tried my best, Fransson. I have tried my best to sever myself from these accursed strings without pulling them to pieces,"
pleaded the same shrill, familiar voice.
"Wilt thou help me to do so?"
Another twang, still more prolonged and dismal, resounded within the case, now dragged about the table in every direction by some interior power, like some living, wriggling thing, the twangs becoming sharper and more jerky with every new pull. It was not for the first time that Steenio heard those sounds. He had often remarked them before. Indeed, ever since he had used his master's viscera as a footstool for his own ambition. But on every occasion a feeling of creeping horror had prevented him from investigating their cause, and he had tried to assure himself that the sounds were only a hallucination. But now he stood face to face with the terrible fact, whether in dream or in reality he knew not, nor did he care, since the hallucination, if hallucination it were, was far more real and vivid than any reality. He tried to speak, to take a step forward, but as often happens in nightmares, he could neither utter a word nor move a finger. He felt hopelessly paralyzed. The pulls and jerks were becoming more desperate with each moment, and at last something inside the case snapped violently. The vision of his Stradivarius, devoid of its magical strings, flashed before his eyes, throwing him into a cold sweat of mute and unspeakable terror. He made a superhuman effort to rid himself of the incubus that held him spellbound, but as the last supplicating whisper of the invisible presence repeated,
Do help me to cut myself off,"
Franz sprang to the case with one bound, like an enraged tiger defending its prey, and with one frantic effort breaking the spell. "Leave the violin alone, you old fiend from hell!" he cried in hoarse and trembling tones. He violently shut down the self-raising lid, and while firmly pressing his left hand on it, he seized with the right a piece of rosin from the table and drew on the leather-covered top the sign of the six-pointed star, the seal used by King Solomon to bottle up the rebellious jinns inside their prisons. A wail, like the howl of a she-wolf moaning over her dead little ones, came out of the violin case.
"Thou art ungrateful, very ungrateful, my friends,"
sobbed the blubbering spirit voice.
"But I forgive, for I still love thee well. Yet thou canst not shut me in, boy. Behold!"
And instantly a greyish mist spread over and covered case and table, and rising upward formed itself into an indistinct shape. Then it began growing, and as it grew, Franz felt himself gradually enfolded in cold and damp coils, slimy as those of a huge snake. He gave a terrible cry and awoke, but, strangely enough, not on his bed, but near the table, just as he had dreamed, pressing the violin case desperately with both his hands. "It was but a dream, after all," he muttered, still terrified, but relieved at the load on his heaving breast. With a tremendous effort, he composed himself and unlocked the case to inspect the violin. He found it covered with dust, but otherwise sound and in order, and he suddenly felt himself as cool and determined as ever. Having dusted the instrument, he carefully rosined the bow, tightened the strings, and tuned them. He even went so far as to try upon it the first notes of the witches, first cautiously and timidly, then using his bow boldly and with full force. The sound of that loud, solitary note, defiant as the war trumpet of a conqueror, sweet and majestic as the touch of a seraph on his golden harp in the fancy of the faithful, thrilled through the very soul of Franz. It revealed to him a hitherto unsuspected potency in his bow, which ran on in strains that filled the room with the richest swell of melody, unheard by the artist until that night. Commencing in uninterrupted legato tones, his bow sang to him of sun-bright hope and beauty, of moonlit nights, when the soft and balmy stillness endowed every blade of grass and all things animate and inanimate with a voice and a song of love. For a few brief moments it was a torrent of melody, the harmony of which, tuned to a soft woe, was calculated to make mountains weep, had there been any in the room, and to soothe even the inexorable powers of hell, the presence of which was undeniably felt in this modest hotel room. Suddenly, the solemn legato chant, contrary to all laws of harmony, quivered, became arpeggios, and ended in shrill staccatos like the notes of a hyena laugh. The same creeping sensation of terror as he had before felt came over him, and Franz threw the bow away. He had recognized the familiar laugh, and would have no more of it. Dressing, he locked the bedeviled violin securely in its case, and taking it with him to the dining-room, determined to await quietly the hour of trial. 6. The terrible hour of the struggle had come, and Stenio was at his post, calm, resolute, almost smiling. The theatre was crowded to suffocation, and there was not even standing room to be got for any amount of hard cash or favoritism. The singular challenge had reached every quarter to which the post could carry it, and gold flowed freely into Paganini's unfathomable pockets, to an extent almost satisfying, even to his insatiate and venal soul. It was arranged that Paganini should begin. When he appeared upon the stage, the thick walls of the theatre shook to their foundations with the applause that greeted him. He began and ended his famous composition, The Witches, amid a storm of cheers. The shouts of public enthusiasm lasted so long that Franz began to think his turn would never come. When, at last, Paganini, amid the roaring applause of a frantic public, was allowed to retire behind the scenes, his eye fell upon Stenio, who was tuning his violin, and he felt amazed at the serene calmness, the air of assurance of the unknown German artist. When Franz approached the footlights, he was received with icy coldness, but for all that he did not feel in the least disconcerted. He looked very pale, but his thin white lips wore a scornful smile as response to this dumb unwelcome. He was sure of his triumph. At the first notes of the prelude of The Witches, a thrill of astonishment passed over the audience. It was Paganini's touch, and it was something more. Some, and they were the majority, thought that never, in his best moments of inspiration, had the Italian artist himself, in executing that diabolical composition of his, exhibited such an extraordinary diabolical power. Under the pressure of the long, muscular fingers of Franz, the chords shivered like the palpitating intestines of a disemboweled victim under the vivisector's knife. They moaned melodiously like a dying child. The large blue eye of the artist, fixed with a satanic expression upon the sounding board, seemed to summon forth Orpheus himself from the infernal regions, rather than the musical notes supposed to be generated in the depths of the violin. Sounds seemed to transform themselves into objective shapes, thickly and precipitately gathering, as at the evocation of a mighty magician, and to be whirling around him like a host of fantastic, infernal figures dancing the witches' goat dance. In the empty depths of the shadowy background of the stage, behind the artist, a nameless phantasmagoria produced by the concussion of unearthly vibrations seemed to form pictures of shameless orgies, of the voluptuous hymens of a real witch's sabbat. A collective hallucination took hold of the public. Panting for breath, ghastly and trickling with the icy perspiration of an inexpressible horror, they sat spellbound, and unable to break the spell of the music by the slightest motion. They experienced all the illicit enervating delights of the paradise of Mohammed, that came into the disordered fancy of an opium-eating Mussulman, and felt at the same time the abject terror, the agony of one who struggles against an attack of delirium tremens. Many ladies shrieked aloud, others fainted, and strong men gnashed their teeth in a state of utter helplessness. Then came the finale. Thundering, uninterrupted applause delayed its beginning, expanding the momentary pause to a duration of almost a quarter of an hour. The bravos were furious, almost hysterical. At last, when after a profound and last bow, Stenio, whose smile was as sardonic as it was triumphant, lifted his bow to attack the famous finale, his eye fell upon Paganini, who, calmly seated in the manager's box, had been behind Non in zealous applause. The small and piercing black eyes of the Genoese artist were riveted to the Stradivarius in the hands of Franz, but otherwise he seemed quite cool and unconcerned. His rival's face troubled him for one short instant, but he regained his self-possession and, lifting once more his bow, drew the first note. Then the public enthusiasm reached its acme, and soon knew no bounds. The listeners heard and saw indeed. The witches' voices resounded in the air, and beyond all the other voices, one voice was heard. Discordant and unlike to human sounds, it seemed of dogs the bark, of wolves the howl, the doleful screechings of the midnight owl, the hiss of snakes, the hungry lion's roar, the sounds of billows beating on the shore, the groan of winds among the leafy wood, and burst of thunder from the rending cloud. 'Twas these, all these in one. The magic bow was drawing forth its last quivering sounds, famous among prodigious musical feats, imitating the precipitate flight of the witches before bright dawn, of the unholy women saturated with the fumes of their nocturnal saturnalia, when a strange thing came to pass on the stage. Without the slightest transition, the notes suddenly changed. In their aerial flight of ascension and descent, their melody was unexpectedly altered in character. The sounds became confused, scattered, disconnected, and then, it seemed from the sounding board of the violin, came out swearing, jarring tones, like those of a street punch, screaming at the top of a senile voice,
"Art thou satisfied, Franz, my boy? Have not I gloriously kept my promise, eh?"
The spell was broken. Though still unable to realize the whole situation, those who heard the voice and the Punchinello-like tones were freed, as by enchantment, from the terrible charm under which they had been held. Loud roars of laughter, mocking exclamations of half anger and half irritation were now heard from every corner of the vast theatre. The musicians in the orchestra, with faces still blanched from weird emotion, were now seen shaking with laughter, and the whole audience rose, like one man, from their seats, unable yet to solve the enigma. They felt, nevertheless, too disgusted, too disposed to laugh, to remain one moment longer in the building. But suddenly the sea of moving heads in the stalls and the pit became once more motionless, and stood petrified, as though struck by lightning. What all saw was terrible enough. The handsome though wild face of the young artist suddenly aged, and his graceful, erect figure bent down, as though under the weight of years. But this was nothing to that which some of the most sensitive clearly perceived. Franz Steenio's person was now entirely enveloped in a semi-transparent mist, cloud-like, creeping with serpentine motion, and gradually tightening round the living form, as though ready to engulf him. And there were those also who discerned in this tall and ominous pillar of smoke a clearly defined figure, a form showing the unmistakable outlines of a grotesque and grinning, but terribly awful-looking old man, whose viscera were protruding, and the ends of the intestines stretched on the violin. Within this hazy, quivering veil, the violinist was then seen, driving his bow furiously across the human chords with the contortions of a demoniac, as we see them represented on medieval cathedral paintings. An indescribable panic swept over the audience, and breaking now, for the last time, through the spell which had again bound them motionless, every living creature in the theatre made one mad rush towards the door. It was like the sudden outburst of a dam, a human torrent, roaring amid a shower of discordant notes, idiotic squeakings, prolonged and whining moans, cacophonous cries of frenzy, above which, like the detonations of pistol shots, was heard the consecutive bursting of the 4 strings stretched upon the soundboard of that bewitched violin. When the theatre was emptied of the last man of the audience, the terrified manager rushed on the stage in search of the unfortunate performer. He was found dead, and already stiff, behind the footlights, twisted up into the most unnatural of postures, with the catguts wound curiously round his neck, and his violin shattered into 1,000 fragments.
When it became publicly known that the unfortunate would-be rival of Niccolo Paganini had not left a cent to pay for his funeral or his hotel bill, the Genoese, his proverbial meanness notwithstanding, settled the hotel bill and had poor Steenio buried at his own expense. He claimed, however, in exchange the fragments of the Stradivarius as a memento of the strange event.
If you enjoyed listening today, be sure to subscribe to the channel by hitting the red subscribe button below. After doing so, click the bell icon next to the subscribe button to receive new content notifications. If you'd like to support our work and receive exclusive perks, consider becoming a channel member by clicking the join button below. To support us in other ways, see the video description for links to our Bandcamp and Patreon pages, our merch store over at Teespring, and further information relating to our releases on Audible, iTunes, and Spotify. And until next time,